What's up, my over 200 subscribers and the 70% who haven't subscribed yet? Welcome to part 6 of What If a Serial Killer Reincarnates in Naruto as Blind Swordsman. If you are enjoying the series, please for me like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. With that, guys, enjoy. POV Akira. It was a great failure on my part. I was, at first, unable to find any entrance to the hideout, so I stalked the wasteland near the mountain for the first day. But then I managed to track some cultists going in and out of the hideout. I wanted to get in myself, disguise myself as one of the cultists, but it didn't go quite as I expected. The one I tried to take at covertly was an immortal. How was I supposed to tell? They were all dressed up the same, probably because they were going on a mission or something. The immortal was able to alert more people, and things escalated from there, with quite a few cultists joining in, and a different immortal also coming out to take care of things. I wasn't expecting them all to have decent skills. I tried to run away, but I was quickly encircled and taken down. I had no chances against two immortals, and one of them seemed to be able to control my body with a straw doll, after putting a strand of my hair on it. I should have known better. I should have listened to the master's words and just observed from a distance. But it's already far too late for that. From the moment I was captured, things became a blur. I didn't have any recollection of how I ended up in that cell. All I know is that two panic cultists entered it, and started taking out their stress on me. And that was also when I learned that, for some reason, I couldn't die. The only apparent downside was I was hungry, ravenously hungry. Now, this may have also been just because they hadn't fed me in God knows how long, but at the same time, I have starved for weeks in the past, and it was never like this. I felt a hunger so great that I ended up cannibalizing my own tongue repeatedly. At some points, I was so crazed that I tried to bite off the faces of my torturers. The more they tortured me, the more I felt like I was becoming less and less human. The hunger was transforming me. That was when Ken arrived. My two torturers, who had acted all high and mighty for as long as I've known them, were crushed like ants in front of the red dot. The first thing I did when I regenerated my gouged out eyes was to look at their corpses. I took a bit of enjoyment in seeing their fearful faces, but that was about it. I passed out after realizing I was safe. Finally got a break from the torture and pain. The hunger is still there, but I need rest just as much as I need food. When I woke up, I was already tied to my master's back, and we were going home. That was when I first acted out. I took a bite out of his shoulder, ripped out a bit of his cloak and bit him near the neck, a place where his shoulder plates didn't extend to. I am ashamed to even think about it now, but back then, my mind was so clouded in hunger and insanity, that it simply felt like the right thing to do. After swallowing down the badly chewed up chunk of flesh, my mind cleared up, and I realized what I had done. I was both ashamed and scared of what I had become and what I had done to my benefactor. But Ken didn't seem to particularly care. His genuine response to that was, "Oh, I guess you were hungry." His shoulder was also healed up before I had even finished swallowing it. He didn't mention anything of it after that. He merely stopped, hunted down a few animals, and cooked them over a fire for me. I couldn't move or do anything to help. My body was still far too weak. The little nutrition I got from being a mindless cannibal only got me to the point where I could regain my consciousness. But with food right in front of me, I was barely able to hold myself back. I dug in like a hungry bear, eating the most I had ever eaten in one sitting ever. Ken also seemed surprised, seeing me eat the portions of 10 men in a few minutes. But he went along with it, hunted more and more until I was finally back on my feet. After that, we silently made our way back to the compound. It took a few more days to get there, but we were going at a surprising pace. Somehow, I was actually able to keep up with Master. It seems that on a full stomach, I am much stronger than before. Maybe my ordeal was a blessing in disguise after all. At least I thought so, until my stomach started aching slightly. It was only then that I noticed how bloated it was. After all, I had eaten an overwhelming amount of food. Where would all the waste go? Ken, however, seemed to have been expecting that. I was afraid that this would happen. That was the first time I heard about one of the many downsides to my condition. I am unable to defecate normally. We didn't know the specifics at the time, but most of my organs aren't working at all. Food isn't even being digested, and I am just absorbing some energy from food made out of living things anyway. Ken had to cut open my belly, allowing a lot of poorly chewed up and unprocessed food to spill out of my body alongside my organs. Maybe my senses have dulled due to the torture, but it barely felt like I was pricked by a wasp. The only actual hard thing in that ordeal was watching my own organs spill out of my body once again. Thankfully, I seemed to heal relatively quickly with my energy replenished. Even after emptying out my stomach, I was satiated for a good few days. Whenever I got even slightly hungry, we would immediately start hunting and cooking some meat. It kept going like that all the way to the Dark Brotherhood compound, where the first thing that I did was to step into Suburo's laboratory. Suburo himself seemed jealous of my newfound immortality. I could see quite a bit of greed in his eyes. As a former thief, greed is something I am very familiar with. I wonder if he'll try replicating whatever happened to my body. Regardless, I had a lot of testing ahead of me. Honestly, I was expecting the study done on me to be a more grueling experience, similar to that of torture. But Saburo is, at the end of the day, a friend. Despite his greed and jealousy, he treated me very well throughout the whole thing, speaking to me all the time, which was strangely comforting. He even used some natural herb with an anesthetic effect to numb my whole body, before actually doing anything, so the entire thing was completely painless on my part. We ran through a plethora of different tests and looked for different things, even compared my constitution to that of the immortal we still have captured. Saburo seemed to have taken out his vocal cords, but he was still alive, and well, scratch that. He was just alive. Regardless, we found out that the curses used on me were not any different to the ones used on our prisoner. Apparently, they just had different reactions in my body. It did kill off most of my organs and their functions, but it in turn made me a lot stronger. I was faster, more dexterous and more focused, and even had more chakra, at least while full of energy. My newfound powers had rather clear downsides. Besides killing most of my organs, regenerating and using chakra in general would lead to me becoming hungry. I could handle a bit of hunger, but I also became much weaker with it. At my hungriest, I wouldn't even be able to lift a finger, while being peckish brought me down to my previous strength. Saburo was able to find out that I basically only absorbed some energy from the food I ate. This led to him creating a special diet for me, which made it a lot easier to empty out my stomach. It was mostly just soups, eating only liquids and crushed herbs. It seemed to do the trick just fine. It still required me to stab a funnel into my stomach, but at this point, I am happy with whatever leniency I get in the end. The conclusion that Saburo had reached regarding my constitution was that I had achieved some sort of regenerative immortality. I could even regenerate from burns, so I didn't even have the same weaknesses as the other immortals. He said that the cult leader, who was most likely the one to experiment on me, would never be able to get the same result he did with me. It was a 1 in a million, quite literally an infinitesimal possibility of all of the curses coming together to create such an effect ever again. Even then, it wasn't really immortality. I wasn't actually unaging. He said that at some point, the curses would kill my body completely, but it would likely take a few good decades for that to happen. More study would be needed, but that is the time frame he provided me at first. To me, this basically just means that I'll basically die of old age. I am okay with this. I still get to live a full life at least. Tosho was less okay with it though. He was mad at me for my recklessness. I couldn't exactly blame him. He knows that I was told to not get close to the cult, so he knows that I fucked up quite a bit. Him being hard on me just shows that he cares. Really, Master is still a bit harder to read. No one knows that I harmed him while in a mindless state. I didn't have the courage to mention that to either Saburo or Tosho. Ken himself seems to have forgotten about it already, but even then, I can see him sometimes slightly turning his head away from me when I'm in the room. I can somewhat feel him tacitly avoiding me at times. I have already apologized profusely, and even cried when I came back to my senses at that moment. But even then, I feel like I deserve this treatment. I betrayed his trust. Not only did I disrespect his orders, I even injured him after he went out of his way to rescue me. He even neglected further building relations with the Cloud Village after the mission in order to take me back to base. Shame. It was a total failure caused by none other than me. Guilt and shame are all I will be able to feel around Ken now, at least for the foreseeable future. EOV narration. While Akira was racking his mind with useless thoughts and misplaced emotions, Ken was looking at things from a very different perspective. To him, he had put one of his men in harm's way due to his own carelessness. Just because he had been once interested in a random cult, he pursued that cult, culled it, and put all of his people in danger. He was the one to make things right by exterminating it. Sure, but it was still because of him that everything had happened the way it had. I have to be more careful in the future. I'm no longer a lonely assassin traveling the world. I have more responsibility, people depending on me. The young leader took a few days to reflect on his actions and on how to improve in the future. The Dark Brotherhood was not yet at the point where it could even stand on its own. Even the smallest hidden village would be able to wipe it out without Ken being there. But even with Ken being there, the Dark Brotherhood wouldn't necessarily be safe. Ken's mission with the Reikijin gave him quite a bit of perspective. He was still weak. too weak to even protect himself. If the Reikage decided to attack his Dark Brotherhood, he wouldn't have any other choice but to die. And if B wanted to erase it from the world, he could do it in a few seconds. I need to get stronger. In the end, it all came back around to power. If Ken was strong enough, he wouldn't have had to put any of his subordinates in danger in a scout mission. He wouldn't even have had to worry about the cult attacking them in the first place. And so, the blind assassin was now determined his training would start that very second, as he jumped out of his room and went into the forest nearby. POV narration: after training for a few days, Ken ended up reaching a point where he truly didn't know what else to improve. His swordsmanship was stagnant. It was unlikely to grow much without some actual stimulation in real fights to the death. His chakra levels were already as large as he could make them. His young age didn't allow for a lot more than that. He could keep at it, training his already overtrained body further, hoping to see some results in the long term. But Ken simply felt that he was wasting his time. After all, he had no guarantee of results down the line. He was already in the best possible shape for an assassin. All he needed was to grow and keep active. He could try to learn a few more jutsu, but he didn't really have anything that would be able to help him against the likes of Jiki and the Reikage. So that would also turn out to be a waste of time. In the end, he decided to focus on his transformation. After all, it was his trump card. It gave him speed similar to that of A, and it was also the only way he could see himself fighting the Reikage. But how would he go about developing his transformation anyway? He lacked a basic understanding of what he even was. He did know how his body worked though, and he knew how the Scaled Sage mode manifested itself, and under what conditions. The conditions were, he needed to be out of chakra, mostly out of chakra anyway. The point was that the balance between chakra and nature energy within his body needed to be tilted towards nature energy. If he ran out of chakra completely, he would turn into a statue. Besides that, he also had a self-made condition, which was to not attempt to use any jutsu while in that form. After all, if he ran out of chakra completely, he'd be left helpless against his enemy. So he needed to balance things perfectly. Nothing he wasn't used to though. But the entire Scaled Sage mode felt imperfect to Ken, impractical even. Ken was one of the few people that could fight, while paying that much attention to the balance between the energies within his body. Unbeknownst to him, that was the exact reason why so many people had a difficult time becoming sages, and why there were so few of them in the world. It took quite a bit of concentration, especially for Ken, as it was made even worse by the fact that chakra was being constantly replenished with time. Meaning that if Ken wanted to stay in that form, he'd have to expel it constantly in order to maintain the supremacy of nature energy within his body. Is there any way to stop chakra from flowing into my body? In the end, the blind assassin ended up asking his retainers. Akira, the now immortal third blade, wasn't able to give him any answer, as he didn't have any formal training as a shinobi. Tosho, the first blade, did help Ken understand a few more things about the human body, like the way chakra flowed and that it traveled through different channels throughout the body. He also remembered to tell Ken about the points where chakra could leave the body, but even he wasn't able to give many specifics, as his days learning about the basics were long behind him. In the end, Ken ended up in Suburo's laboratory. The second blade was able to give him a much more thorough explanation of the human body and the chakra network, even drawing an illustration by hand, leaving deep imprints on the paper, and allowing Ken to read it. Chakra travels through us in these channels, as I'm sure you already know, but it's quite self-contained. Ken nodded as he felt the diagram that Saburo had drawn for him. It all made sense. He was able to build an image of the chakra network that was drawn on the paper. But he also knew that chakra wasn't just continued within one's body. After all, if that was the case, then shinobi wouldn't be able to practice their jutsu. Chakra comes out of the body through various specific points located at key spots throughout the body. These special points are called tenketsu/pressure points, and there are 361 of them in the human body. They are very small, unseen to the naked eye, about the same size as the tip of a needle. Saburo filled the diagram of the chakra network that he had drawn with dots. His hands moved fast as he spoke confidently. It was clear that he knew the human body by heart. He answered so quickly that it felt as if he didn't even need to think about it. Ken nodded when hearing that. It was the first time he received such in-depth knowledge about chakra networks. Interesting, the masked assassin said as he rubbed his chin while feeling the points laid on paper with his other palm. Is there any way to stop chakra from flowing to a specific part of the body? Yes. Chakra flows from the core, which is near the stomach. So stopping the flow to, for example, a limb, would be as easy as hitting all the tenketsu near the shoulders, which would clog them and halt the chakra from traveling to that arm. There is even a clan able to accurately hit the tenketsu and disable a shinobi from using chakra. Saburo answered instantly, remembering how the Dojutsu/bloodline ability of the Hyuga allowed them to see the tenketsu of people. But don't get any ideas. Even with your speed, it's impossible to hit the tenketsu of other shinobi during a fight. The clan I was talking about is just special. Saburo was quick to discourage Ken from trying to imitate the Hyuga. There were many young shinobi that thought themselves special. They ended up dying while attempting to hit the tenketsu. thinking that memorizing them on a piece of paper would enable them to hit a moving target in the middle of a wall. And Saburo knew that Ken was strong, so there wasn't much worry about him dying. But he thought it would be a waste of time to even try. One needed to hit the Tenketsu with a small chakra scalpel of the same size as the hole. It needed absolute precision, which was what made it impractical. But Ken still found it interesting for different reasons. So, in theory, one should be able to strike the Tenketsu on their own body to halt chakra flow, correct? Saburo blinked a few times while looking at his leader. The very notion of a shinobi disabling himself in combat was strange to hear, but it did make sense for Ken. Yeah, he only transformed after depleting his chakra. Maybe it's a prerequisite. Is he looking into ways to partially transform? After mulling over a few more thoughts, the researcher looked at his leader and smiled. Well, only if one was to have more than one type of energy in their body. Ken smiled underneath his mask at that, as he realized he could use nature energy for that. Well, at least in theory. He still needed to test it. He asked the scientists to teach him how. Saburo agreed instantly, and the two immediately got to work. After that, Saburo and Ken spent the rest of the day pointing out the Tenketsu on Ken's body. Saburo also demonstrated how they would be hit on Ken's body. The concept was that they needed to be clogged with foreign energy in order to be blocked. First, Saburo clogged the pressure points for Ken's right arm. In the next few seconds, two things happened in succession. One, his arm bulked up in muscles and transformed, growing scales. While his nails grew into sharp claws, then, his arm turned to stone, before Ken even had the chance to clench his fist. Saburo immediately retracted his hand, while Ken just sighed and forced the Tenketsu to open up by manipulating the chakra in his body to rush towards it. I was afraid of this. I'll have to look into ways to not fully stop the flow, but only restrict it heavily after the Tenketsu was unclogged. Ken's arm turned to normal, and the blind assassin clenched his fist a few times, and moved it a bit as he regained feeling in it. Saburo was a bit surprised to see the arm of his leader turn to stone, but at that point, he knew to expect the unexpected from Ken. It didn't even shock him to hear that Ken would turn into a statue if he fully ran out of chakra. In the end, it was up to Ken to find out more about how to properly clog his Tenketsu. Saburo was only able to help him so much at the end of the day, but he was able to give Ken a bit more information on another subject he had been curious of, and that subject was tailed beasts. It had taken a back seat in his mind due to Akira's situation, but now that things had settled down, he decided to find out more about them as well. Needless to say, there wasn't much that Saburo could give Ken in terms of background. He did help the blind assassin with a bit of perspective on how powerful they were. Tailed beasts are weapons of mass destruction, wielded by the 5 great villages. There are 9 of them in total, and they were shared with the 5 villages by the first Hokage, who had captured them all at some point. The beasts are sealed in humans who are called Jinchuriki. They are usually stigmatized and feared even in their own villages. They were meant to be a deterrent of sorts, but they're just used in wars nowadays. Some nations do protect their Jinchuriki more than others, but that's about it. That was about the gist of what Saburo knew regarding tailed beasts. It wasn't exactly something within his field of study. Even then, Ken was more than pleased to find out even that much. Finding out that the tailed beasts were basically living nukes did give him quite a bit of perspective. It was likely that the first Hokage had likely hoped they'd work like nukes and stop too many future wars from happening. But unfortunately, the tailed beasts and their Jinchuriki weren't the strongest beings in their respective villages most of the time, so the wars still waged on. As long as people could benefit from wars, they'd keep happening. The shinobi were also nothing more than tools, with few exceptions. The true leaders of the 5 lands were the daimon, who always wanted more land and riches. They weren't going to be dissuaded by the tailed beast's existence still. The concept of Jinchuriki greatly intrigued Kentucky. I should look more into that in the future. Maybe I'll even see about recruiting one if the possibility arises. It was more of a pipe dream than anything, but it didn't matter. It wasn't like Ken was going to seek out Jinchuriki, although, if they were all mistreated, then it wouldn't be all that difficult to convince them to join the Dark Brotherhood. All in due time. For now, I still have a few things I'd like to learn from Saburo. Thank you for all of your help today. Second Blade Ken started off by showing his gratitude, and Saburo responded in kind, by nodding and smiling at his leader. Of course, it is my duty as one of your blades. The scientist's smile was still fake. It didn't matter how much he faked care and compassion to the rest of the Brotherhood, it would never manage to fool someone like Ken. He was still not someone that Ken thought of as loyal, but he was still a valuable asset. I am still curious about one thing. I won't bother you anymore after that. Oh, I wouldn't dare call it a bother, Saburo said as he used his expert boot-licking skills. His fake smile did disappear eventually though when sensing the lack of reaction from Ken. He had forgotten that he didn't need to keep any pretense around the blind child. There was no fooling him. Why exactly are you so interested in immortality? And why are you researching Genjutsu instead of immortality if it interests you so much? Saburo didn't react one bit to Ken's question, his face remaining expressionless before he blinked a few times and raised an eyebrow. Well, I thought you wouldn't be one to pry into my research. The researcher sounded a bit wary, likely unwilling to give Ken all that many details about his research. Don't misunderstand my meaning, I by no means want to interfere with your research. I am genuinely curious. The blind leader was quick to calm down the wary scientist. He was being honest when saying that. After all, normally he wouldn't even care what Saburo was doing with his free time very well. I can tell you a bit. It's not like it's going to harm my research in any way. Say, have you ever heard of the immortal hermit? POV narration. Immortality could be achieved in many ways. In Ken's past life, it was nothing more than a pipe dream of a few deluded people. However, in the world he found himself in, that pipe dream appeared to be a possibility, be it through curses or whatever other means. It was clear that immortality was achievable. Hell, even Ken himself was technically immortal. His nature energy granted him a somewhat permanent regeneration. The blind swordsman could recover from just about any wound as long as his body still had energy, and his energy was being replenished every second, the rate of which only increased as he grew older. However, the best example of actual immortality that they had was Akira, who was now, by all accounts, impervious to most types of damage. However, those were all strains of immortality, but they were incomplete. Akira's power was born out of an amalgamation of curses that just happened to click right within his body. And Ken's power could still be subverted, as he wasn't confident in surviving a DECLAIMER yet, and wounds inflicted by fire always regenerated slower. No one had perfect immortality, at least no one that Ken was well aware of. Saburo, however, seemed to have heard of something rather interesting while on his research, finding the ancestral shrine of a forgotten clan that had been ruined during the Warring States period. There, Saburo was able to find a rather interesting journal in a well-hidden library. The story goes into detail, talking about a hermit that had mastered Genjutsu to its very peak, to the point where he was technically unbeatable. With a simple hand sign, he could trick every sense of a person. Hear, sight, smell, taste. He could trap someone in either hell or heaven, anything his imagination allowed. Ken listened to Saburo's story with interest, immediately intrigued by the possibility of there being someone with enough mastery of Genjutsu to actually affect him as well. The clan, however, was wiped out. The hermit lost in battle, despite his overwhelming prowess. He couldn't ever defeat the man that was to become the god of shinobi, Hashirama, and his counterpart, Madara Uchiha. The blind assassin sighed as he remembered whatever information he had about the god of shinobi, Senju Hashirama. Someone considered the greatest shinobi to have ever lived, with enough power to put a stop to the Warring States period. Madara Uchiha was just as powerful, and their union was what stopped the war in its tracks. The blind swordsman didn't know much about the Uchiha, but he did know that the Sharingan was a dangerous Dojutsu, and that they were impossible to catch in an illusion, thanks to it. Ken's knowledge of the history of the shinobi world was quite decent after all. Tosho had done a good job in teaching him about the most legendary figures in their world. Madara Uchiha proved to be a great counter against the hermit's illusions. Hashirama was a bit more susceptible, but even he could overcome them through sheer will. Ken scowled as a few questions rose in his mind. How did this hermit even survive for 1 second against the two of them? If they both could resist Genjutsu, then how could he even begin to hold his ground? That was when he discovered that as long as one had enough mastery and will, one could bring illusions to reality, merge the plane of imagination to that of the living. Ken tilted his head when hearing that. If one could actually control reality as they would Genjutsu, then wouldn't they classify as a god? But he couldn't do it in any significant manner. At most, he could alter small facets of reality, and only related to the caster he was killed in that fight. But he didn't actually die. Instead, in his last moments, he placed himself under a Genjutsu, one in which he allowed himself to live. The blind swordsman scratched his chin. So this hermit just placed himself under a Genjutsu to live eternally. How would he even go about doing that? What of his actual physical body? His heart didn't beat, but his mind still lived on for eternity under that Genjutsu. His body was too far gone, but with that Genjutsu, the hermit was able to do one thing, stopping his body's time. But the reality was not as kind. By the time he broke out of his own spell, his family was already destroyed, with nothing left behind. King couldn't help but interrupt Saburo at that point. So you're telling me that this man was able to influence his real body through Genjutsu, essentially stopping himself in the moment of his death? The matter was a tad too outlandish to believe. But then again, Ken was now in the type of world where such things could happen. Even if it was hard to believe, the blind swordsman would have no choice but to. Yes, he stopped time for himself. The journal was written by the hermit, documenting his afterlife. As a person stuck in time, he could no longer use any chakra, He could no longer enjoy food, breathe, or do anything really. Suburo's smile didn't die down at all as he continued telling of his findings. At that point, Ken could do nothing more than carefully listen and digest the information. But he could still move his broken body. His perception of time was skewed. A second could pass in real time, but it would feel like years in his mind. He moved his body like a marionette with such delayed responses that it took him years in real time to write out a few journal entries. I could tell, thanks to the way the ink had dried, that it was around a decade spent writing weight. So he can't use chakra, and he spent years trying to desperately write down his story. Is it that even he can't even break out of his own genjutsu? The blind swordsman gulped a bit, and Saburo smiled at his realization. Indeed, he was stuck in that form, in that broken body, unable to properly pass on. Though I am quite unsure if he is still alive to this day. He may have also found someone to dispel the genjutsu for him by now, if it's even possible. I wasn't able to find his body anywhere in or near that ruined clan. He could still be alive. He did proclaim to be impossible to injure. When writing the journal, he claimed to have tried to kill himself repeatedly as well. At that point, King couldn't help but feel bad for the so-called immortal hermit. After all, the man had essentially denied himself any chance of rebirth or reincarnation by trapping himself in his own mind. He prolonged the last second of his life eternally through a poorly understood technique that he had barely mastered. And now he was stuck in limbo. King couldn't help but sigh once more as he thought of that. So this hermit, are you looking more into genjutsu, wanting to replicate his techniques? I hope to one day be able to replicate his techniques, but I'd much rather explore the art of genjutsu in its entirety. I have already run several tests. Now I am curious about how the time dilation between reality and illusion could affect one's mind both physically and psychologically. Ken nodded when hearing that. He truly hadn't expected to hear such a concise answer from Saburo after all. The strawman was not exactly a team player Ken expected to not get any answer at all. Instead, his mind was open to countless new avenues. Provided that the story was indeed true, and Saburo wasn't messing with him, there was a high probability that Shinobi truly had no understanding of the techniques they were using, at least not as much as they liked to believe. The world around them was a lot stranger than Ken had initially thought it to be. And that said a lot, since Ken had originally thought of the world as one where seeing ninjas spitting fire was a regular thing. Thank you for entertaining my curiosity, Saburo. I seem to have taken up quite a bit of your time. Ken slowly got up and walked towards the door. He still needed a bit more time to mull over his own thoughts and digest everything, but he didn't see the point in wasting any more of his researcher's time. No need to mention it. Leader, I will keep you posted on any findings I may have. If you need anything else, I will always be around these halls. Saburo also stood up as Ken left, bowing slightly in a respectful manner. The blind leader just nodded and left, humming a bit to himself as he clenched his hand a few times. In the end, every story of immortality that he had heard always made it out to be some sort of curse. He simply had no example where it was a genuinely positive change for the people that were struck by it. That was certainly not what I expected to hear from Saburo. But I should get back to focusing on partial transformation. No use in mulling over some suffering immortal right now. The leader then went ahead with his partial transformation training. He went outside, still within the Dark Brotherhood compound, and sat down near the trunk of a large tree. He took a deep breath and controlled the energies within his body before he started it. His fingers formed almost invisible chakra blades at their tips, and Ken started by trying to transform only his right arm. He did so successfully for 1 second, before the arm turned once again into a statue. The blind leader quickly unclogged his tenketsu, allowing his chakra to flow into his arm once more. The blind assassin repeated those motions for hours on end. Recruits spotted him at some point, but no one dared to disturb him, not out of fear, but out of respect. Ken didn't rule with an iron fist. Though his training was strict, and his methods were scary to some of them, no one actually feared the man that had created the Dark Brotherhood. How could they fear the man that had given them another chance at life? Besides, Ken had managed to instill one thing into all of the recruits at that point: discipline. It was something that an assassin needed for survival. It was something essential to Ken's organization. The children with disabilities, the ones too young to care for themselves, and even the talented ones. They were all treated the same, treated like brothers and sisters. And all of them learned to respect the one that had made it all possible. Indeed, it was that respect that stirred a powerful wish to one day be able to repay their father for all that he had done for them. And it was that powerful wish that enabled all of them to keep up with the Dark Brotherhood's borderline sadistic training. They were all pushed to the very limits of their bodies on a daily basis, only allowed rest days once every 3 weeks. And even then, not one of them ever complained about the training. After all, how could physical pain ever compare to the pain they all felt when watching their families die? How could it ever compare to the helplessness they all felt when they couldn't do anything to stop it from happening? Ken and Tosho's methods worked wonders in turning the perceived trauma of the children into strength. But they all still had a long way to go. so did Ken. They were all young, and they had their whole lives ahead of them. And time moved quickly for those that trained diligently though, and 1 year passed before anyone knew it. EOV narration: a year passed by without anything exciting happening. Life was slow in the Dark Brotherhood compound. All of the members were diligently training and getting used to their new circumstances. Since the Brotherhood had stopped expanding, the bonds of the members grew tighter and tighter. Time passed and true friendships were born. Ken didn't discourage such friendships, especially among children, but he would have to teach them to keep a level head eventually. He didn't plan to send any of the children to their deaths, but it was inevitable for all of them to face death if they ended up pursuing his line of business. Relationships that were forged and strengthened over time fell apart at a moment's notice. All it took was a moment's mistake, and years of bonds would crumble apart under the weight of the cruel world they lived in. Ken was now wise enough to understand that, and he didn't want any of his disciples to blindly chase revenge, like he had that day yet. He was also underestimating his recruits. They had all faced death already. Not one of the children training under him didn't know what loss was. In the end, Saburo ended up being the one to reassure him. After all, one could become desensitized to loss as well. Other than that, Ken's training produced great results. By the time his 12th birthday rolled around, he had already gotten the hang of hitting his tenketsu properly. The secret he had discovered was to only restrict the flow of chakra in his arm instead of clogging it completely. It wasn't a difficult conclusion to reach, but actually putting it into practice felt near impossible at first. Thankfully, Ken's control over the energies that resided within his body was always monstrous. He had grown even further in that regard to the point where he was sure that his control was already on par with the greatest. The partial transformation was mostly a completed technique. Ken didn't even need to physically touch his tenketsu anymore, as he could simply clog them using the chakra that already flowed constantly in his body. Unclogging them was even easier since it was his own chakra. He only needed to send a jolt of energy through the pressure points, and his arm would turn back to normal in seconds. Overall, Ken's training was a massive success. He had grown much stronger. The blind assassin had also grown much taller in that short year. He was already standing at around 1.7 meters, 5.6 feet, and he had to repeatedly get new clothes for himself as he grew taller through the months. He still showed no signs of stopping. It seemed that he had rather decent genes when it came to height. Now, one could argue that it wasn't optimal for an assassin to be overly tall, and that would certainly be true for the most part. At least in Ken's old world, being tall didn't help him much. It really only got in the way, and made him easier to spot. But with the advent of nature energy and chakra, Ken was confident that he could remain undetected even if he was a giant. His sudden growth spurt did raise a rather interesting issue. Though others are bound to notice that I grew taller, his identity as a child assassin was definitely going to be exposed. At best, they would think him a teenager. But even that wasn't ideal. Ken knew that people in high positions would always look down on those younger than themselves that are entering a similar field. The Land of Iron's delegation had thankfully not noticed his height increase, as Saburo had taken it upon himself to deal with them appropriately. The second blade knew how to properly manage relations, and knew how to put up a proper front each time the delegation came to check up on them once more. Thankfully, the Land of Iron never actually ran a proper checkup on the compound. They didn't venture farther than the streets. The checkups themselves were more of a formality, especially since the daemon still owed Ken a favor. Even if they saw something strange, the daemon was unlikely to call Ken out on it. Well, not all things could be ignored, but they didn't need to know about the overwhelming amount of human experimentation going on in the underground laboratory. It wasn't important knowledge, and Ken didn't see anything wrong with it, cause he can't see at all, since it was being done on criminals anyway. Overall, everyone advanced quite a bit during that year, even the recruits. The oldest among them was already at the level of a chunin, having also mastered a few jutsu from their open libraries. The library was still not as full as Ken wanted it to be, but it allowed their recruits to read a bit more and gain a bit more insight into the world. That was also where they stored most jutsu under the C rank. The higher ranking jutsu was still accessible if the recruits were deemed talented enough though, and they had plenty of talent in their organization already. Besides the chunin level assassin, the rest were mostly at the genin level. Most of them had gotten the hang of taijutsu at a very basic level. They also were trained in kenjutsu and different techniques, such as trap laying, hunting and survival skills, that Ken thought would serve them well while out on missions. They were all still children, of course, not anywhere near the level where they could be sent out on missions or to collect bounties. Ken was still actually against using child soldiers, so he planned to wait for them to at least be within the 14 to 16 range before sending them out on missions under supervision. That meant they had more time to train within the safety of the Dark Brotherhood compound, and the compound was becoming safer and safer as the blades had now become true powerhouses, at least in Ken's opinion. Saburo had always been one. His clones were technically carrying the Brotherhood on their back. Tosho was arguably just as strong as Saburo, but he lacked the numbers. He also went out on difficult missions occasionally, hunting A-rank shinobi/criminals by himself. He was not yet at the level where he could hunt S-rank shinobi by himself, but that was fine. His progress was outstanding regardless, but the Dark Brotherhood did have another person besides Ken that could hunt down S-rank criminals, and that was the third blade, Akira. He had already gotten completely used to his situation. Being immortal was certainly a great boon to his strength and combat ability. He instantly became the second strongest person in the Dark Brotherhood, right behind Ken. Saburo helped him greatly by torturing the curse technique, death controlling possessed blood out of their immortal prisoner, who was still alive. The second blade had to use a variety of genjutsu and torture methods in order to squeeze out that information from the depths of the insane immortal's mind, but it was all worth it. With it, Akira was strong enough to hold his own against most people. It was a technique so powerful that even Ken learned it, though he was not going to be able to use it as casually as Akira. Stabbing his own heart was something that he could still die from. But that was not the case for their resident immortal, the third blade. There were only two viable ways of fighting Akira. One was to whittle him down by repeatedly injuring him until he went mad with hunger. If Akira managed to complete his curse technique, then that strategy went off the table. And the other was to seal his movements somehow, catch him in a trap or in a seal that he could not escape from, and let him starve to death. But that wasn't going to be easy in the first place. In the past year, Akira's combat prowess grew exponentially, to the point where Ken was sure he would be able to give the third Reikage's son, a run for his money. He was far above the other immortals he had met in the cult of Jashin that day, but there was still one huge problem that the Brotherhood was currently facing. That was their lack of defenses. Sure, they had decent numbers in Saburo, they had powerful fighters in Tosho and Akira, but they still lacked something that most other hidden villages had: formations and seals around the compound. Ken was able to detect whenever anyone came by, but it was not good to just rely on him. What if he decided to go on a mission? Would others just be able to sneak into the compound? It was a rather concerning thought, especially now that the Dark Brotherhood had built quite the reputation. They had already become well-known headhunters in the Land of Iron as well as the surrounding lands. That renown made it easy to find work, but it also planted somewhat of a target on their back. Plenty of hidden villages showed interest in them, especially after news of the Reikage hiring the Red Dot spread. There had also been convenient recruits popping up on their doorstep, claiming to be from nearby orphanages and asking to join. Ken was able to deduce that they were spies, at least most of them. Regardless, he sent them all back. The Brotherhood was not recruiting anymore. They were already stretched thin enough in trying to train over 80 recruits. But the appearance of spies from nearby hidden villages was a bad omen. No one in the Dark Brotherhood had true mastery over Fuinjutsu, which was a rather large issue. Ken wanted to change that, but even then, he had no clue where to find more techniques related to the art of sealing. All he had were the ones he had stolen from other shinobi, the very basic jutsu that he used for storage and transportation. That was about it. Saburo knew a few more seals. He had used them to lock up a few entrances in his laboratory, but they weren't powerful seals. At most good enough to cause an explosion of similar size to a paper bomb, but quite useless against someone with significant strength. As always, Saburo was able to enlighten Ken as to why Fuinjutsu was so hard to come by, and the reason was also quite simple: monopoly. The more powerful techniques were all in the possession of one clan. They held all the leverage and kept their techniques close to their chest, which was understandable as Fuinjutsu was their bread and butter. The Uzumaki clan are renowned for their mastery over Fuinjutsu as well as their absurd chakra reserves. Their clan is thought to be on par with the great hidden villages, and they are believed to be in good relations with the Leaf Village. That was most of the gist of what Saburo was able to tell Ken in regard to the Uzumaki clan. Their general location was common knowledge, as none of the hidden villages were actually hidden. So, now the leader of the Dark Brotherhood had to make a decision: either try to strike a deal with the Land of Whirlpools, or try to steal some techniques from them. It had been a while since he had done a diplomatic outing. His reputation still held up though. He was likely going to be given an audience with the Uzukage. Without much issue, Ken decided to depart as soon as possible. After all, the Reikage had already warned him of an upcoming war. It had already been a year, so the blind assassin could safely assume that war was right around the corner. Better hurry to the Land of Whirlpools before the war. Large-scale conflicts like that will make getting an audience with a leader much harder. And so, the blind assassin donned his mask, armor plates and large coat. He put on a large straw hat with strips of fabric going down all sides. He was going to go incognito for the most part, as he didn't want the other hidden villages to try something funny in his absence. I should make the journey in a week or two. If nothing goes wrong, of course. POV narration. Ken's journey towards the Land of Whirlpools went without a hitch. He stayed off the radar without any issues, and was able to easily avoid any patrols from the Land of Hot Water. The Land of Whirlpools was technically situated south of the Land of Hot Water. However, the Land of Whirlpools is an island, and there were no bridges to connect it to the main continent. It was secluded and cut off from the rest of the ninja world, at least geographically speaking. They still held diplomatic ties to a few lands nearby. The only way to reach it safely would be to go through a boat service that was situated in the Land of Waves, which was also an island that could only be accessed from a bridge connected to the Land of Fire. The waters near the Land of Whirlpools were dangerous as could be, and one could only really approach it from any side besides that of the Land of Waves. Any ship would capsize, and the waves would swallow any human whole with ease. Even powerful shinobi couldn't resist the force of Mother Nature. The human body was weak after all, but Ken was different. He was far from weak, far from human even, and nature itself seemed to understand that. Nowadays, wild animals didn't even dare to get close to him. He could feel it, their fear as he dashed through their territories. Some would just freeze and tremble in place as if waiting to be killed, while others would choose to turn around and run away. It was a change that had occurred a bit after he had gained a bit more mastery over his scaled sage mode. It was as if he had become a bit more in tune with nature. It was as if the world seemed to understand his nature a bit more. He was sure that animals in water would also refrain from attacking him, so he didn't have to worry about any sharks, whales, or whatever other abominations that could be found in the world. He also knew that he was strong enough to wade through any whirlpool that tried to pull him underneath the waves. After all, he could always create a tornado large enough to undo the whirlpool. So the choice was obvious for Ken. Instead of taking the detour and going through the Land of Fire and Land of Waves, he decided to simply swim south when reaching the border of the Land of Hot Waters. He was to do so for many kilometers/miles. But he never did have any problems with stamina. He did consider making some makeshift boat and trying to sail there, but he wasn't exactly a sailor, and he figured it'd be much faster if he swam than otherwise. And he waded through the waters for almost 2 days. His energy was constantly replenishing his stamina almost endlessly even in the water. His nature energy allowed him to notice if something came too close to him, but most of the time it was him passing through the territories of different schools of fish. They always swam away when sensing his presence. Ken was quite shocked by that, as he remembered fish to be somewhat unintelligent. Some would even jump into the mouth of a predator. Without realizing it, maybe animals in this world are just more intelligent. That would make sense. Or maybe they all just instinctually avoid me now. At some point, Ken decided to go faster. So he blocked the tenketsu in his arms and legs, as well as some other parts of his torso, which allowed him to swim at twice the speed. From the distance, he looked like a speedboat dashing through the water, cutting it with frightening ease. Ken also noticed some strange changes to his body. After a few minutes of swimming, his body seemed to morph a bit. As he brought his fingers together, he noticed that there was now more matter in between them. He parted them only to realize that he had grown fins, which allowed him to swim even faster. His legs were the same, and it wasn't long before he noticed that his neck had morphed as well. Instead of just being covered in scales, it had now grown gills which allowed him to breathe underwater. Well, he wasn't actually breathing, just absorbing oxygen from the water around him through said gills. But it was still bizarre. Why is this change happening now? I trained in water before. Was it because I didn't use my scaled from as much? The blind monster was confused as he waded through the waves with ease. Is my body just adapting to whatever place it finds itself in? It seems like it, but I can't be too sure. Might have to go to a few more environments to test things out. I really need to visit that toad sage. The whirlpools couldn't even hope to slow him down at that point. It would only be a matter of hours before he hit the shore. The first thing Ken did when stepping onto shore was to crawl further and hide in the foliage. He made sure that his tracks were washed away by the rising tide as he rested in that bush for a few minutes, allowing his body to turn back to its regular form. The Land of Whirlpools was not exactly small, so Ken still had a day left of traveling before he reached Yuzashiogakuka, the main base of the Uzumaki clan. Ken rested a bit more after that, allowing himself to catch his breath, and even sleep for around 30 minutes, as he gave his clothes time to dry up. It was annoying to sneak around in wet clothing after all. It would be harder for him to hide his tracks. Thankfully, he could feel no one nearby. At least not at that moment. The shinobi of Yuzashiogakuka was still likely patrolling the area, as the borders of a land were always the most defended unless the Uzumaki relied on their natural defenses, more than Ken thought they would. Regardless, it was none of Ken's business. He slowly got up and resumed his journey. He did encounter patrols a bit further inland, but he was able to go undetected through all of them. Most of the shinobi he ran into all had something in common. They all seemed to have a substantial chakra reserve, to the point where it was hard for Ken to judge their levels. No, to be more specific, it was impossible for Ken to tell what their rankings were. He had yet to meet even one shinobi with chakra reserves lesser than that of a jonin, but he highly doubted that the Uzumaki clan was that powerful. Saburo did say that the Uzumaki are well known for their absurd chakra reserves, I guess this makes my job a bit more difficult. Sneaking around was always harder when you weren't able to judge your opponents. Thankfully, Ken wasn't there on any assassination mission. He was just there for diplomatic reasons and to steal their shit if they didn't agree to work things out with him. He did things similarly to the way he had approached the Cloud Village. This time, things would be a bit more difficult though, as he didn't have any valuable information. At that point, he hoped his reputation and the quality of his services would be enough to gain him an audience with the clan leader. Saburo had informed Ken that he wasn't exactly considered a kage, as the Yuzashiogaku was not exactly a hidden village. It was just a clan, one of the strongest clans still standing. Sure, but still just a clan. The title of kage was reserved for the leaders of the hidden villages. This made things a bit confusing, since it meant that the land of whirlpools didn't actually have a hidden village. But Ken assumed it was likely just something done to avoid taxation, or something similar to that. He could respect that. However, the array that surrounded Yuzashiogaku was much larger than the one in the Cloud Village, to the point where Ken was spotted far before he even reached the gates. Wish there was something I could do to hide from Fuinjutsu as well, but I don't know anywhere near enough about seals to avoid such a complex array. Much like in the Cloud Village, Ken started walking slowly as he continued heading for the clan's village. And in a similar fashion, shinobi of Yuzashiogaku were already surrounding him a few seconds after he stepped into their territory. They didn't make their presence known though. They seemed to want to observe him first. The fact that they were still a few good kilometers away from their clan base gave them some leeway in the way they could approach such an intruder at first. They seemed to be planning some form of attack, and Ken realized that they likely didn't recognize him because of the hat that was still hiding his mask. He immediately took it off, tying it to his belt as he turned, and pretended to look at the people surrounding him. They reacted immediately as soon as he took off his hat. Dozens of kunai and shuriken were thrown at him. The trained shinobi had attributed his sudden movement to something else, and had attacked without a second thought. Thankfully, Ken was expecting that. Instead of panicking, he took out a small umbrella from the seal on his wrist. He opened it up and spun it at great speeds. It was made out of a special/flexible metal, a gift from a certain politician in the land of iron that wanted to befriend him. Ken managed to block all of the incoming projectiles before coming to a stop, closing his umbrella and plunging it slightly into the ground. Greetings, people of the Uzumaki clan, I am here with a business proposition. The relation of his identity didn't even get to sink in when Ken started speaking. The ones that had started preparing some justice immediately stopped themselves. Ken could feel the shock and fear in the people that surrounded him, but there was also a strange sense of confidence. I guess they don't actually think I'm a great danger to their village. Well, I can't blame them. They're sure to have some seals to defend it. After a few more seconds, a shinobi stepped out from the cover of the shadows. Ken could feel that he was a tall, middle-aged man with short hair. He had relatively handsome features, and he even seemed to wear a headband. His clothing was similar to that of jonin from other villages, but it was also different enough for Ken to not be able to tell his rank easily. Similar to the Cloud Village, in a sense. Red Dot, we have heard much about you and your organization. I must apologize for the lackluster greeting. The shinobi bowed slightly as more came out of the shadows. Around 20 shinobi were all looking at Ken with calm gazes, prepared to jump in if anything went wrong. I dislike lavish greetings, mister. Ken was quick to ask for the name of the person he was speaking to. It didn't feel like he was speaking to just a nobody after all, even by Uzumaki standards. The man's chakra reserves were absurd. He seemed to be more powerful than any other shinobi he had felt on the island. Oh, my name is Uzumaki Yorihiko, son of Ashina Uzumaki. The man's voice sounded a bit surprised. He spoke with a raised eyebrow while looking at Ken and blinking a few times. Ken tilted his head slightly as he tried to remember a bit more about the name. It didn't take long for him to realize who Yorihiko was referring to, son of the former Uzumaki clan head. Damn, I wasn't expecting to meet the clan leader so soon. Was he just passing by or something? Ken immediately brought his hand together and bowed slightly. Apologies for the disrespect, Lord Yorihiko. I was not expecting to meet you out here. The blind assassin could only curse his bad luck a bit as he realized that a good first impression would be a bit more difficult. At the very least, he hadn't attacked any of his men, so things could certainly be much worse. Yorihiko just chuckled a bit when sensing Ken's frustration. He did throw the assassin a few curveballs, especially when he bowed in greeting. A clan head wouldn't usually behave in such a way to outsiders. After all, the men that were with him were also startled by it. But they decided not to question their lord's actions at the end of the day. Ken calmed down a bit when sensing Yorihiko's amusement. All is well, Red Dot. I assume you came here covertly to avoid the eyes of the other hidden villages, correct? Yorihiko didn't laugh for long. He reassured the assassin as well, and continued the conversation in a cordial manner. Please, just call me Ken, and yes, I didn't wish to raise much attention from the surrounding lands. Yorihiko nodded when hearing Ken's answer and introduction. Very well, I did have a job. but I can postpone it for now. Shall we continue this conversation in my office? The clan leader gestured for the blind assassin to follow. Ken nodded and went along with him. He's a lot more agreeable than I thought. Let's just hope negotiation doesn't go wrong. EOV narration. At first, Yorihiko didn't quite know what to make of their guest. He had guessed that it was likely just a messenger from the hidden villages, skilled enough to sneak past all of their patrols and get in proximity to their detection seals. Some of his men decided to test him with a few attacks. He was trespassing into their territory after all. The second he unveiled himself, Yorihiko started thinking about the worst possible situation. A known assassin paying you a visit is rarely a good thing regardless. Yorihiko was confident that he would be able to keep Ken at bay, especially within their territory. There were countless seals all over their hidden village. It was a fortress that few could overcome, although it had never really held back someone that was as strong as the assassin visiting them. Thankfully, the Red Dot, or Ken, had no intention of starting any trouble with the Uzumaki clan. It was the opposite actually. Yorihiko was glad to hear that, although he was still wary. He wanted to test out the assassin's personality a bit more. After judging his character a bit and deciding that he was trustworthy enough, he decided to invite Ken to continue their negotiations in his office. Yuzashogaka was built mostly out of stone. It actually felt a lot like a modern city, and the infrastructure is similar to that of city blocks from back in his old world. Their buildings all had the symbol of their clan carved into them. The symbol was present everywhere, from walls to support pillars and even statues. Ken was able to see it himself. He even noticed a rather peculiar pattern with the clan symbols. Most of the time, the symbol of the clan seemed to be hiding symbols that made up seals. He wasn't actually able to make out what the seals were for, as his fuinjutsu was lackluster, but he still found it impressive clearly. The Yuzashogaka was not something he had many chances of infiltrating. Even if I knew more about seals, most of these have been carved by actual masters. Undoing them or avoiding them wouldn't be easy. There were hundreds of people on the streets, but not all of them seemed to be of the Uzumaki clan. At least Ken felt that a few of them didn't have the characteristic massive chakra pool. The city seemed to be built near a dam, allowing a small river to run through it, with a few boats traveling here and there. The Uzumaki clan is a lot bigger than I thought it would be. He hadn't expected there to be so many members of the Uzumaki clan. There were well over 200 members that he counted within the city among the civilians, and their clan seemed to also make up the vast majority of shinobi in the village, so their number was certainly much greater. As a not that old clan, it was quite strange to see them in such numbers. There were really no old clans from what Ken was able to tell, with his limited knowledge of history. The warring states were when most of them were established, and what he was sensing solidified his belief that the Uzumaki clan was certainly the largest. Well, it did make sense for them to have as many offsprings as possible. They did have superior genes to the majority of the shinobi world. The office of the clan leader was not in any special building or place. It was just a regular block like the others. The leader just happened to have his office there. Unlike the other hidden villages, it was impossible to tell apart the most important building from any other, which was honestly a good strategy, something that Ken was hoping to replicate as well. After all, having a large building for the cage or clan leader instantly informed all intruders that yes, this is the building. One thing that Ken had to admit was that the building, despite looking normal, was certainly the most looked after in terms of seals. There were shinobi patrolling throughout the village, and all of their routes also seemed to come in the vicinity of the clan leader's office. It was clear that unless someone was able to infiltrate the ranks of the Uzumaki clan to gain intel, it would be exceedingly difficult to attack their village. Yorihiko reached his office and finally sat down with a sigh. Two guards appeared by his side. Both felt like powerful shinobi to Ken, at least as strong as the clan leader, at least in chakra reserves. Ken sat down as soon as Yorihiko gestured for him to do so. He took his seat on one of the nearby chairs and faced the clan leader while crossing his arms. So you were saying that you are interested in doing business with my Uzumaki clan? The leader decided to get into business right away. He was a rather busy person after all. Yes, business first. And I'm sure you can figure out what I might want from your clan. Ken nodded slightly, as his words lingered in the air for a bit. Yorihiko smiled at the masked assassin. Indeed, there are a few things that other villagers always request of us. It's related to fuinjutsu most of the time. Other times they wish for political ties, to include our bloodline within their villages. Needless to say, we all tend to have some disagreements regarding that last part. Yorihiko didn't bother hiding the state of affairs from Ken, as he assumed the assassin already had knowledge of his clan's dealings. Well, I am really only interested in seals, specifically the techniques. I am not looking for marriage. Thank you very much. Ken just raised his palms dismissively as he realized just how much importance the Uzumaki clan had to the other hidden villages. A powerful bloodline always attracted attention, it seemed. Maybe it would be better for him to keep his strange nature-related bloodline a secret. His comment did seem to bring out a chuckle in Yorihiko and the two guards that stood behind him. It seemed that the amicable atmosphere allowed them to slightly relax, although both the clan leader and the guards were still alert from what Ken could feel. Well, that's a shame. There were plenty of eligible bachelorettes in our clan. I'm sure we could have found someone willing to marry one with your reputation. Yorihiko decided to entertain Ken for a bit, but the laughter and smiles in the room died down rather quickly. His business was never only about one side. So what can you offer in exchange for our techniques? Even the most rudimentary ones that we have are invaluable to the hidden villages. The clan leader decided not to beat around the bush with Ken, as he was able to observe that the assassin was rather straightforward in his intentions. Well, as I'm sure you're aware by now, I run an organization that deals in assassination. Ken nodded as he started speaking. He paused for a few seconds, checking to see if the clan leader had looked into him in the past. The Dark Brotherhood, was it? Rather broody of a name. Yorihiko understood the masked assassin's intentions. He had no trouble confirming the fact that he had looked into the state of affairs in regard to the shinobi world's most famous bounty hunter/assassin. It does portray a certain vibe. I'd call it fitting. Currently, however, there are very few members that could prove useful to your clan. Most of them are still recruits after all, and I am not going to send my children to war. Not for you nor for anyone. Yorihiko simply nodded at Ken's words, though he didn't exactly agree with the masked assassin's ideals. His views were different, as he was a bit more old fashioned or normal for the era, I guess. In a time of need, everyone needed to do their part and assist the clan however possible at the end of the day. But he wasn't going to judge Ken for having opposing views. While I can't promise to send my recruits to help you anytime soon, I can vow personally help with anything that the Uzumaki clan may need, from protection to getting rid of threats, from recon to assassination and everything in between, as long as it doesn't require me to turn too many of the great villages against me, of course. Ken was quick to offer his own services, something that Yorihiko could respect, putting himself forward to give his recruits time to grow. It was certainly a commendable approach, but it was also a bit concerning. While your personal services are valuable, if we are to help your organization, we need some assurance that they can function without you there. If you happen to be outside the village, and it gets attacked, can you ensure us that the organization is able to protect itself? If not, how can we possibly entrust any of our techniques to you? Yorihiko voiced his concerns immediately. After all, the techniques of his clan were sought after. Even if he didn't give Ken anything crucial to the Uzumaki clan, he still needed to make sure that the techniques were protected. The Dark Brotherhood was obviously not allowed to spread the techniques they took from the Uzumaki. That was how most deals the Uzumaki made worked. Ken could understand his apprehension as well. The Dark Brotherhood's affairs weren't exactly public, so most people thought that Ken was really the only figure of any significance in it, but that wasn't the case anymore. I can assure you that my people are capable enough to protect our main base. Currently, we have one assassin who can fight even against people at the level of the 5 cage, Akira, and one that is capable enough to go against most elite Jonin Tosho. Besides them, there are around 30 shinobi ranging from Chunin level to Jonin that are constantly at the base Saburo and his clones, minus the ones that are out collecting bounties, protecting it. Ken gave Yorihiko a rather basic description of their strength. It was more than he would normally be willing to give off, but if it was needed to secure more Fuinjutsu techniques, then he was more than willing to disclose it. I find it difficult to believe you're telling me that there is another man at the level of the 5 cage within your organization. Yorihiko was obviously skeptical. Rightfully so. Only the strongest of the 5 great hidden villages could boast about having more cage level figures within their ranks. I can't give you too much information on his identity. Meeting him would also be difficult, since he is tasked with protecting the compound in my absence. But I am willing to stake my name and reputation on the validity of this information. Ken decided to play the reputation card. It was impossible for him to prove that Akira, the third blade, was truly at the level of the 5 cage. He did know that Akira was strong enough to fight against them, even kill them under the right circumstances. But he had no way to prove it unless he sent Akira after one of them. Regardless, Ken was at least confident that Akira was stronger than the Kazukage and the Mizukage. From what he gathered, that Tsuchikage, Hokage and Reikage were all on their own level. It is a bit difficult to just take your word for this, especially since lying would benefit you in this situation. Yorihiko still wasn't budging. Reputation will only take me so far. Ken couldn't help but sigh in disappointment. I can certainly understand your apprehension. There's no reason for you to make a decision right away. I can stick around for a few days. Ken decided to give it some time. But Yorihiko seemed to have something else on his mind besides that. Something you said earlier seems to linger in my mind right now. You said that you are unwilling to make enemies out of too many hidden villages, correct? Yorihiko crossed his arms and looked at the masked assassin sitting in front of him with a calm gaze, awaiting a response. Yes, I am willing to fight alongside you, but antagonizing too many powers at once might not be beneficial to my organization in such an early stage. Ken did consider lying to the clan leader for a few seconds, but he didn't think he'd get much out of a flimsy promise. It seems that this won't work out in the end. I am not expecting you to die for my clan, but the current situation requires allies that are more involved. Yorihiko shook his head, ending the negotiations abruptly. The guards behind him seemed to tense up at that moment, likely expecting Ken to try and pull something off, but thankfully, Ken didn't seem to be hostile to them even after negotiations broke down. Instead, he just seemed curious. Current situation. The land of whirlpools appears to be peaceful. Currently, Yorihiko couldn't help but sigh at the masked assassin's words. Might as well tell him, there's not much that can be done at this point. A war is brewing, Ken. One that is even bigger than the last. And I'm afraid our Uzumaki clan is going to be the first one to fall. POV narration. This is quite problematic. Ken couldn't help but ponder on his conversation with the leader of the Uzumaki clan as he left their village. Yorihiko didn't give him much information directly, but what he did give allowed Ken to speculate on the rest, and it certainly didn't paint a good image. Not only did he learn more about the current situation of the Uzumaki clan, but he also found out why exactly he had encountered that many patrols. Usually, all lands had shinobi patrolling them, but in times of peace, things were always more relaxed. That wasn't the case for the Uzumaki clan, and, by Yorihiko's admission, that hadn't been the case for the Uzumaki clan at any point in the period of peace. After the Second Shinobi War, Yorihiko already expected his clan to be ruined, to the point where he sent his daughter, the heiress of the Uzumaki clan, off to another village. It was under the pretense of her becoming a Jinchuriki, but it was really just so that they could secure the continuation of their bloodline. The village hidden in the leaf was the one ally they entrusted with the life of their bloodline, at least publicly. Unfortunately, the Leaf Village wasn't going to be able to assist the Uzumaki clan in any other way. The Leaf Village was the most powerful hidden village at that time, but even they couldn't hope to match up against the powers aiming for the Uzumaki clan. What powers were those exactly? Well, nothing short of just about every other hidden village in existence. The way that the Uzumaki clan ran their business, the stranglehold they had on higher class Fuinjutsu techniques, and their enticing bloodline. Those were the things that made the Uzumaki clan a prime target for every single power in the world. Yorihiko realized that early into the Second Shinobi War, and he started taking steps to protect their bloodline. He even considered going into hiding with their entire clan, but that was simply impossible. They would simply be hunted down and systematically murdered. He still planted the seeds, making sure to spread the offspring of the Uzumaki clan in more corners of the world. He didn't want the burden of rebuilding the Uzumaki clan to just lay on his daughter's shoulders. No one expected the world to actually band together. The Uzumaki clan could stand on its own, but it would never be able to win against the combined might of the entire shinobi world. The destruction of the land of whirlpools was imminent in Yorihiko's eyes. He could at most try fighting till the end to try and uphold the dignity of the clan. He fully understood that his clan had become a powder keg, one that was going to explode and jumpstart the next shinobi war. The clans and villages were definitely going to fight over the resources taken from the Uzumaki clan, and the Leaf Village was going to strive to avenge them. At least Yorihiko hoped so. Regardless, he had already steeled himself to make a last stand in Yuzashiogakuka, which he had worked hard to turn into an actual fortress. Whatever forces came their way, they were bound to be met with adversity. Yorihiko was going to inflict as many casualties as he could. The only thing he couldn't bring himself to do was to burn the techniques of his family. They were what their clan had researched and worked towards for generations. He simply couldn't do it. Though he did impart them to his daughter, he still wanted the original copies to exist in the world regardless. Very few of their high-end techniques could actually be performed without the bountiful chakra reserves of the Uzumaki Fuinjutsu experts. Yorihiko had turned Ken away, both because forming an alliance with the Dark Brotherhood wasn't going to benefit the Uzumaki clan, and because he had no assurance that Ken would even uphold his part of the deal in the first place. At the end of the day, Ken did specify that he wasn't willing to face off against too many great powers. The Uzumaki clan's situation didn't allow for such thoughts. The blind swordsman couldn't help it though. He wasn't alone anymore. Even if he was to be hunted down by the entire world, he wouldn't be afraid. With his skills, he was confident that he could still survive. But he couldn't sneak around with around 140 people following after him. The Dark Brotherhood was as much a blessing as it was a curse. It both gave Ken a way to reach his aspirations and limited his actions in situations like the one he was currently in. The Uzumaki clan's plight was still concerning. Ken had felt plenty of women and children in that village. He had assumed that they would all be evacuated, but it seemed that most were unaware of their impending doom. Maybe evacuating all of their villages would be too big a move. The other powers were certainly going to notice it. Not like they had anywhere to go either. They'd all be hunted down like dogs. Regardless, one thing was clear: a lot of innocent people will die alongside Yurihiko, and the Uzumaki clan innocence had always been a sore topic for Ken. No one was fully innocent, but Ken believed that civilians had no reason to be involved in the conflicts of the shinobi. In his mind, he had separated their current world in two: the regular world, with civilians and their day-to-day struggle, and the shinobi world, with bounty hunters, bandits, hidden villages and their wars. Sometimes they overlapped, as Ken believed most criminals to be part of the shinobi world regardless of whether they performed jutsu or not. It was just about the way that killers conducted themselves. That bloody way of living could never really be considered part of the regular world. Ken had seen plenty of civilians inside Yuzashiogakuka, plenty of non-fighters in the Uzumaki clan. Even if they were living in a Shinboi clan, Ken believed them to be part of the regular world. Letting them die simply left a sour taste in his mouth. But what could he even do about it? Could he face off against the world by himself? Hell no. Well, at least not yet. He was strong, sure, likely stronger than anyone the Uzumaki clan had on their side, but his personal strength had its limits. Facing off against thousands of shinobi, as well as several kage, was going quite far beyond those limits. But there was still something he could do. Ken was, at the end of the day, an assassin, someone that specialized in stealth, and the shinobi were many, numerous. Thousands of men and child soldiers, all prepared for a short conquest, likely lacking food, clothing. They were unlikely to be prepared for a long campaign. But the Uzumaki clan is a fortress. They are bound to spend a day just waiting to attack at their gates slowly. But surely, a plan was forming itself in the mind of the assassin. But he knew that he couldn't act as he was. He needed a disguise, and thankfully, he had the perfect one. It didn't require any transformation either. He had collected several masks and different items from the many shinobi he killed. He decided to just steal the identity of one of the shinobi. With zero hesitation, Ken also took out a small knife and sliced off his long spiky hair in one swift motion. His hair was going to grow back at the end of the day. He also took off his samurai armor plates and put on a simple linen vest that he had stolen in the past. He couldn't be the leader of the Dark Brotherhood during his mission, but that was also fine. The only person that knew how he looked now was the leader of the Uzumaki clan. The rest of the shinobi world had the description of a short man, but he had grown already. So, when donning a random Fox Ambu mask, he was basically a completely new person to the world. He didn't even need a name for his new identity. A name wouldn't have any practical use. But thanks to said identity/change, Ken now had the possibility to interfere with the ensuing war. He still wasn't strong enough to make a difference in a fight, but he had plenty of other routes he could take, other options to make things more favorable for the Uzumaki. His aim was to at least give the clan leader some leeway in evacuating the non-fighting members of the Uzumaki clan. I need to gain his cooperation first. Better get to work right away. I'll send a few messages his way, but I need to keep my name out of the record entirely. The blind assassin had already given up on gaining the techniques from the Uzumaki clan. He figured he'd be able to salvage some after the entire mess was over. Possibly even trade with some of the other big powers to gain a few. He would have plenty of flexibility after more techniques came into the possession of others. But that was going to come after the ordeal was over. At the very least, Ken was going to do his best to save the regular people that were going to be involved in that conflict. And while Ken was strategizing and preparing for his plan, the coalition of shinobi that had been aiming for the Uzumaki clan was finally starting to gather up at the only point of access. Thousands of shinobi poured through the borders of the Land of Fire and into the Land of Waves. Neither land got involved, the forces gathered being simply too much for either of them to want to contend with. Most of the shinobi world was banded together now, but it wasn't anything more than a temporary alliance, and only for one common goal. Even then, some lands chose to abstain from getting involved in that matter. The Land of Fire stood still and could only watch. They were both unable to help, and unwilling to go after their ally, the Land of Whirlpools. Besides that, the Land of Grass didn't get involved. They weren't in a much better situation than what Ken had left them in. They hadn't even repaired the cage building, yet some of the other smaller lands also didn't get involved. But the most notable missing power in that conflict was the Land of Wind. Yes, the village hidden in the sand was not participating. Despite being among the 5 great hidden villages, and not having good relations with the Uzumaki clan, the Sunagaga was unable to participate. They had lost a vast majority of their power in the Second Shinobi War, with Konoha's White Fang almost single-handedly dominating the entire battlefield on that front. They were in no shape to go after the Uzumaki clan. They would just get shredded during the afterparty of the Uzumaki clan's demise. After all, dividing the spoils of war was not going to be a peaceful endeavor in any way. The Third Shinboi War was going to start right then and there. That much was obvious to all of the people involved. Besides them, there was also another one of the 5 great villages, that wasn't getting involved. And that was the land of water in Kurigaka. They had just lost the second Mizrich at the end of the Second Shinobi War. Their council was still in disarray even after a year, and no new Kage was appointed. They were simply in no position to make such a large decision and get involved in the Third Shinobi War that early. Now, even without the few forces that abstained from the temporary alliance, there were still thousands of shinobi gathering at the edge of the Land of Waves. It was only a matter of days before everyone was gathered in one place. The boats were already being prepared, as several were being borrowed from local fishermen in the region. The power of almost 8,000 shinobi, an army which also contained two of the most powerful people in the world, the third Reikage, the third Tsuchikage Inoki. The Reikage had also brought along his son, but he didn't bring Ba. Jinchuriki was always better left in the village. That way both the Jinchuriki and the village would be safe. So Killer B was left to protect the village, while his sworn brother was off to gain more experience in the field. The third Tsuchikage was a short man, already past middle-aged. He had just a bit of grey hair left on his balding head. Despite his balding head, he still had a rather thick moustache and a long beard. He wore a split-apart green coat divided into 4 sections with yellow trimmings, and a red collar underneath. That he donned the traditional Awagaka outfit, consisting of a light green vest and mesh armor. He paired all of that with a pair of sandals. But truly, his most defining feature was still his large red nose. Despite his relatively harmless and even comical appearance, he was one of the strongest shinobi alive, wielding what was arguably one of the strongest KKTMTA bloodline limit compromise of 3 nature releases, ever the Dust release. The old Tsuchikage was confident in the upcoming raid. He flew above the rest of his men as he stared at the seas in front of him. In the darkness of the night, the moonlight was barely reflected on the wavy waters in front of him, and for some reason he couldn't help but get a foreboding feeling when looking at the scene in front of him. There's no way things could go wrong at this point, right? Inoki then shook his head. No matter how strong the Uzumaki clan is, they will die regardless. I need to worry more about what comes after, and so, the old man set up camp there on the shore, as they were going to wait a bit more for all of their allies to gather up. Unbeknownst to Inoki, the upcoming march was going to be a lot more grueling than anticipated POV narration. The Shinobi Alliance was quick to gather up. All of the Kage held a meeting in order to decide on the best course of action. Kage from all of the small hidden villages was present, but most of their voices were small. Even with their forces gathered together, they couldn't really compete with the 2 behemoths that also joined in. The Tsuchikage and the Reikage were the only ones that held any actual influence in that meeting. They were to dictate the way that the operation was going to go. Now, one could ask why the smaller villages even agreed to mobilize under such conditions. But it just goes to show just how important Fuinjutsu was in the shinobi world. The smaller forces could only hope to somehow suck up to the larger forces in order to get their hands on some techniques. But together they did form a significant enough force to grab something. After the Uzumaki clan was destroyed even among the smaller villages, there were still notable powers. For one, there was the Kage of the Tokigaka from the Land of Waterfalls. He was the Jinchuriki of the 7-tailed beast Chne. His power was at least on par with the Kage from the large villages, though their shinobi didn't have the same power and skill as the ones from the larger villages. Still, the Tokigaka was certainly a contender for a spot in the 5 great villages, as the first Hokage had seen it worthy enough to receive a tailed beast. There were other groups among the smaller villages, ones formed specifically to grab as many benefits as possible from the Uzumaki clan. The meeting went without any issues, though the atmosphere was certainly tense. Everyone was well aware that they weren't going to be allies for long. As soon as the fight with the Uzumaki ended, the struggle for resources would start instantly. But in their hubris, no one even stopped to consider whether they would be able to even take down the Uzumaki clan. They never even stopped to think how many of them would even make it to Yuzashiogaku. But who could blame them? Together they were a force great enough to take down any hidden village. What exactly could even stand in their way anyway? Well, the Tsuchikage's premonition did end up manifesting. Despite going against his gut, Inoki still suggested the ships start sailing at night, for them to reach the shores of the Land of Whirlpools while it was still dark. The journey was going to take 2 days regardless, but the time of departure was somewhat equivalent to the time of arrival. But it was not going to be a pleasant trip. It all started with the accidents. As soon as they set sail, as soon as the shores of the Land of Waves were out of sight, their ships were slowly starting to sink. The shinobi worked tirelessly to repair the holes that kept popping up here and there. They chalked up the situation to them taking 40 boats from the local populace. But the Reikage was a bit more suspicious, especially since he also noticed a strange shadow stalking through the waters around their ships. But then again, it could have also just been a shark or something. I mean, none of their sensors had said detected anyone trying to sabotage them. And some of the ships did look as if some monster took a large swap at them. But there was nothing they could really do about it. Jumping into the waters was dangerous. Regardless, after a few ships sank, the accidents stopped happening. Some water-styles shinobi were put on guard though, just in case something happened. That helped to further tire the Shinobi Alliance out. Because of their slow response, some shinobi were now stuck in rowboats, and many of them were bunched up together in the remaining ships. Of course, the cage all had their own heavily guarded ships, so they didn't have to worry about cramming in with the other regular folk. But the accidents were far from the worst of it. Just as the regular shinobi thought they could finally relax, the natural disasters started occurring. Whirlpools constantly formed in front of them, forcing them to take detours, or even ruining some of their rowboats. But the worst one was the whirlpool that started right in the middle of their fleet. Many shinobi got dragged to the bottom of the ocean, and the cage were forced to watch as hundreds died in the harsh waters in the middle of the ocean. What the hell is happening? The wreckage was beyond confused. They were taking the safe route, so why the hell would their whirlpools there as well? Had the Uzumaki clan created some sort of formation to control the waters around their land? Highly unlikely. The very concept was ludicrous. It would take an exorbitant amount of chakra even for an Uzumaki Fuinjutsu master. It sounded too wasteful. It was also near impossible to set up such an array on the floor of the ocean. Bad luck it seems. The Tsuchikage scowled as he floated above the waters. But it all felt too convenient. No one really thought that it was just bad luck. Someone was clearly sabotaging them. But their senses hadn't managed to pick up on anything. Maybe it really was just bad weather conditions. The cage moved quickly, sending shinobi to use various jutsu in an effort to redirect the flow of the whirlpools. Water dragons rose out of the whirlpools, spinning in the opposite direction as shinobi jumped in and tried to undo the whirlpool. They managed to rescue some of the shinobi, but many were still swallowed up, not getting the chance to even try to resist the waves by walking on water. The bodies were nowhere to be found. It was almost as if someone had gotten them stuck to the bottom of the sea. Those were the very first casualties of the war, a war that had yet to even begin. The whirlpools continued to happen throughout the night. Their shinobi didn't even get the chance to rest. By the morning, there were at least 1,000 shinobi missing. They were obviously dead, swallowed up by the waters of the ocean. Only the Jonin could really escape the whirlpools, having gotten accustomed to the dangerous waters. But the Chunin that were stuck on rowboats were as good as dead. None of them survived at first. Jonin did their best to save the teams they were leading, but slowly, they all lost hope in being able to do so. The violent currents were far too dangerous for them to do anything. Some still got saved whenever the cage got involved, but everyone was tired by the end of the night. Sometimes, the Tsuchikage would unleash a dust-release jutsu in the eye of the whirlpool, which always seemed to undo them, but that wasn't always possible. Since there were always shinobi around, getting in the way of Onoki's techniques. It wasn't their fault though. They were all being dragged to the point where the Tsuchikage needed to aim. The Tsuchikage also didn't have infinite chakra. Dust release was a very powerful technique, but it was also very demanding. It was a rather large loss, but it was only for the smaller villages. The Cloud Village and the Rock Village were still standing strong, and most of their shinobi were never on the rowboats to begin with. Regardless, together they still had somewhere around 7,500 shinobi, so they were not exactly in any danger of being outnumbered by the shinobi of the Yuzashiogakuka. Unfortunately for them, the worst had yet to come. The morning was mostly uneventful. Even the whirlpools stopped happening, which gave the shinobi some time to rest. Unfortunately, rest was simply not in the books for the poor shinobi of the Alliance. The first one to go was the cage of Kemirigaka from the Land of Tea. His death was witnessed by a few dozen shinobi from nearby ships. The guards on his ship were all found dead, with their heads twisted in odd manners. Most of them looked like they didn't even get the chance to resist. No one got to see how the culprit escaped, as everyone's gaze was attracted by the spectacle. The cage's body was blasted out of the roof of his private quarters. It spun around in the air a few times before landing directly on the top of the mast. The corpse landed with precision right on top of the wooden mast, getting impaled through the abdomen in a gruesome fashion. The cause of death was later deemed to be asphyxiation. The cage's fingers were all twisted, while his eyes were gouged out, and his tongue was nowhere to be found on the ship. An investigation was immediately started, as everyone instantly became vigilant. There could only be one explanation after all. There was a traitor among them. The ship of the cage that had died was strangely spotless. There was only blood in the cage's room, all of which was presumed to belong to him. Besides that, the guards were killed cleanly well. Their heads were twisted to the point where it looked like someone was trying to unscrew their spines from their bodies. But there was little blood involved, just body horror. But the shinobi found a break whenever they found the body of one of the cage's elite guards on the lower deck of the ship. Finally, they had found signs of struggle. Specifically, they realized that one of the kunai of the guard was bloody. While there were no piercing or slashing wounds on any of the bodies on deck, that could only mean one thing: the assassin/traitor had gotten injured. The cage immediately got to work, and their most trusted shinobi all started checking the wounds of their troops. There had been some wounded in the previous nights due to whirlpools, but slashing and piercing wounds were completely different from scrapes and bruises, so they were able to find the culprit right away. And that was where things became even more complicated. The culprit was a Chunin from the Cloud Village. He was the only one among the few thousand shinobi that had managed to get injured by a kunai. Before the shinobi war had even started, the Chunin tried to deny his faults, saying that there was no way for someone like him to be capable of such a thing. He even had a good alibi, which some of his comrades were able to confirm. He had been sleeping at the time the murder took place. He even claimed that he had felt someone nicking him in the back while sleeping, which was what had caused his wound. But who could even believe that? Certainly not the other villagers. The Reikage killed him instantly, claiming that he had absolutely nothing to do with the matter, and denouncing the dead Chunin as a traitor of the cloud. Immediately at that point, thanks to his swift actions, no one dared to challenge the Reikage. But the seed of doubt was already planted. No one dared to trust the Cloud Village. And no one dared to sleep anymore either. The Reikage was mad. He clenched his teeth together so tightly that he had almost cracked them. He wanted to call out that his Cloud Village had been accused wrongly. But who in the hell would believe him? To him it was clear. Someone from the other villages wanted to make his Cloud Village look like the culprit. From that point on, the seas were strangely silent. But no one dared to calm down. They were not even in the territory of the land of whirlpools. And all of them were restlessly looking around, hoping to not be the next victims suddenly. The Shinobi Alliance was no longer as allied. Onoki found the situation annoying as well. He knew that the Reikage was smart enough to not make such a stupid mistake. It was far too suspicious. But there was nothing he could do either. Siding with the Cloud Village was not something he could do, as the smaller villages had all already decided that the Cloud could not be trusted. Onoki wanted to avoid a situation where all of the other small villages ganked up on the big ones. But that possibility was going to be a reality if he made it look like the Cloud and the rock villages were already colluding together. The Tsuchikage racked his brain for hours, trying to find a culprit in his mind, trying to remember who had any grievances with the cage that had been murdered. But he couldn't think of anyone in particular. It was only then that it had finally clicked. Someone is breaking a Shinobi Alliance apart at this rate. We'll be at each other's throats before even stepping into the land of whirlpools. The very thought made the Tsuchikage anxious. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was strong enough to survive regardless. But he knew that the possible losses in that situation far outweighed the benefits. But it was already far too late to return. I need to inform the others now. But that was when the second cage died. The cage from the land of rice. He died in a very similar fashion to the first victim. His ship had been more defended, but this time the guards on the deck and on any other part of the ship weren't even touched. They were alive and well. The bloody weapon was found on the ground in the cage's room, and only the guards that were with him in the room were dead. The second cage's death had been a lot more rushed. He was decapitated, while his men met the same fate. This time, the rock village was blamed for it. The shinobi were more vigilant this time around. No one dared to sleep. Despite no one from any other village believing the cloud shinobi that had been killed, no one wanted to take any chances. But it seemed that it didn't even matter how vigilant they were. Their opponent was far more devious than expected. There had even been other rock shinobi who testified that someone had jumped out of the water, stabbed their comrade in the back with a kunai, and then jumped back in. They were even able to provide a description of the man that had done it. They described a shirtless man wearing a grey fox ambu mask on his face, wearing black trousers and sandals. But which of the hidden villagers was ever going to believe the words of the rock shinobi? The Tsuchikage didn't act as harshly as the Reikage. Instead, he imprisoned the suspect on his ship while they investigated. But his fears were already realized. Much like the Reikage, he sat on his chair in frustration. What will come of this war? But Onoki was not going to take it lying down. He immediately called a meeting with the remaining cage. This is clearly deliberate. Someone is trying to sow discord between us. We need to address this as soon as possible, otherwise this expedition will be doomed before we even get to see the walls of Yuzashogaka. POV narration. The meeting of the cage was set up immediately. It was clear that everyone had something they wanted to say. The situation had taken a turn for the worst in the most unexpected way possible. Onoki had taken extra precautions, so that the cage of the smaller villagers would not feel threatened and refuse to join. He went as far as to dismiss his own guards. After setting up the meeting on his ship, the Reikage, as a show of good faith, also decided to come alone. It was still a bit disingenuous on both of their parts, as the two of them were more than strong enough to fight all the other cage present. But the situation had not yet devolved to the point where the smaller cage felt as if they were all in the crosshairs of the great villages. Some alliance had already formed between the smaller cage, and all of them had brought their strongest to accompany them, just to be sure Onoki was okay with that. He would accept anything as long as the meeting itself happened. He knew that addressing the recent events was of utmost importance. All of their plans were already on the verge of falling apart. They all gathered in Onoki quarters, which were arranged accordingly. All of the cage sat down at that table. There were originally 13 of them in total from the 13 lands that had decided to take part in the operation, but now only 11 of them were left. First off, I want to thank all of you for coming here, despite the recent disaster. The atmosphere was tense, and Onoki knew that he had to start the meeting right away. He would have to juggle all of their worries. and he had to plan out his words as much as possible in order to calm them down. "Huh, disaster," a raspy voice broke out in the room as one of the cage chuckled a bit, his face hidden by a shadow that was cast over his face, thanks to his cage hat. His name was Yudaya Tamichi, and not much was known about him. He was the cage of the village from the Land of Keys. He wore an all-white coat that covered most of his body. Much like all of the other cage present, they all appeared as inconspicuous as possible. It was an assassination through and through. Calling it a disaster might be appropriate, but hearing you speak about it feels a bit strange. Lord Tsuchikage, one of the other cage, also spoke out, his voice etched with a bit of spite, especially by the end of it. Immediately as he spoke out those words, the room broke out into hushed murmurs and voices many had already made reached their own conclusions about the recent events. And none of the recent events painted the great villagers present in a good way. Onoki couldn't help but sigh deeply when hearing the words of his temporary allies. I already expected the worst, but I can't help but be disappointed with their short-sightedness. The Reikage also huffed a bit, knowing very well that the smaller villagers didn't see his cloud village in a better light. I don't see any reason or need to skirt around the issue. Someone is clearly aiming to separate us. Onoki decided to ignore the offended comment of the other cage. Their mission was of utmost importance, and there was no place for petty squabbles and misunderstandings. An eerie silence immediately descended upon the room as Onoki managed to capture the attention of everyone present once more. I also think the same. A gruff voice spoke out this time. Not Onoki nor the Reikage. It was surprisingly the Jinchuriki of the Seven Tails, the cage of the Takigakure Waterfall Hidden Village. He simply went by Yusuzo. He wore clothes similar to the other cage, but his frame was just as large as that of the Reikage. He was a man with an intimidating presence. Ever since the meeting began, he hadn't raised his head once, always staring at the table, as if, and actually in, contemplation. Onoki smiled when hearing Yusuzo. If the Reikage had been the one to agree with him, then it wouldn't have been a good look. Someone that was uninvolved in siding with him was much better. And why do you think that, Lord Yusuzo? One of the other cage asked with narrowed eyes. He clearly had his reservations, but respected the opinion of his peers. It's all too convenient. The same gruff voice was heard as Yusuzo responded without looking up. Ever since we started, accidents have been occurring left and right, boats sinking, whirlpools which shouldn't be happening in these parts, assassinations blamed on the two parties. Everyone was already anxious about it's too convenient. Yusuzo was normally a man of few words, but this time he saw the need to explain his suspicion to his peers. He knew the importance of him doing so. He knew that the fall of their shinobi alliance was already happening. He was smart enough to see through the strange assassinations that had happened as well, yet convenient. But who's to say one of us couldn't have been responsible for that either? We already have evidence pointing towards two culprits, and we all know what villages they belong to. Wait, Yudaya decided to weigh in once more, not holding back with the speculation at all. Although he said one of us, he was clearly only referring to the Cloud and Rock villages, especially by the end of his small speech. Both of the people that got accused of the crimes were at Chunin level at best. One could argue that they were hiding their strength, but that's unlikely. Their chakra reserves said otherwise. I don't think they would have been capable enough to pull off something like that. Even I am not confident enough I could pull that off. Yusuzo didn't seem very perturbed as he spoke, despite bringing many horrifying images to mind. Instead, he was challenging even the validity of the accusations waged against the two great villages. Even better for Onoki, the rest of the cage seemed to somewhat agree with Yusuzo. ESK. I still think the Cloud and the Rock are the most likely suspects. They would have enough reasons to kill us. Yudaya seemed to be determined to cause more problems, much to Onoki's displeasure. It seemed that the Land of Keys really had it out for the two great villages present. He was making a point. Both the Reikage and the Tsuchikage wanted to avoid the smaller cage from forming an alliance. A war between them would still happen after the raid on the Uzumaki clan. But he was mostly sounding ignorant to the people with a better understanding of the situation, people like Yusuzo. Well, if that was truly the case, the Jinchuriki didn't even take a second to think about his reply before opening his mouth again. All of you would already be dead. His voice seemed to somehow make the atmosphere in the room even tenser. Ho, is that so? Yudaya's tone sounded malicious. He clearly felt insulted. Yes, although we are all cage in this room, the Reikage and the Tsuchikage wouldn't need to resort to any tricks. If they truly wanted to get rid of us so soon, Yusuzo's gruff voice didn't falter for 1 second. And he spoke the truth. Among the people at that table, he was the only one that individually had the chance to keep up with the two strongest cage. And that was just because he was a Jinchuriki. We would still survive if a fight were to break out. One of the other cage scoffed a bit, unable to help himself. All cage had their pride after all. They were all confident in their own abilities. They all specialized in different things, and some refused to believe that they were that far behind the 5 cage. but the reality was very different. The Reikage could only scoff when hearing them argue with each other. Whether or not we could kill you is not relevant. The Reikage punched the table in front of him lightly, causing cracks to spread out all around it, and capturing the attention of everyone present. The important part is that we have no reason to even try and kill each other now. Our main mission and objective is to get our hands on the techniques of the Uzumaki. That's why we even mobilized so many of our troops in the first place. The Reikage was clearly frustrated with the whole situation. He immediately started admonishing the people in the room for being led on so easily by the group or person sabotaging their expedition. Alphaga a bit rude, the Reikage speaks the truth in this matter. Onoki coughed a bit in his fist as he tried to dampen the impact of the Reikage's frustrated voice with his own calm one. We all have a common goal, which is the very reason that this alliance came into existence. The fact that we're in this situation means someone doesn't want us to get to that common goal. It goes against both the intentions of the Rock and Cloud villages. I would go as far as to say that it goes against all of our interests combined. Onoki smiled internally as he noticed many of the cage nodding their heads in agreement. It seemed like the meeting was proceeding just as he wanted it, but not without detractors. Shem Phudala still seemed unconvinced, but he didn't seem to speak out anymore, which was at least an improvement. Well, then, now that we've gone through that, I think we can safely assume that the reports of our shinobi were correct. Onoki scratched his chin as he remembered the description of the culprit that was given by his men. The man with the fox mask, it's not exactly a detailed description though. One of the cage muttered as more of them finally started accommodating the theory that all their misfortune up to that point was at the hands of a third party. It reportedly happened very quickly, to the point where my shinobi barely had any chance to react. Onoki scoffed internally as he remembered the reports. In the first place, the one that had gotten blamed was only a chunin, while around him were only genin, so they barely had any chance of capturing the culprit. They were dealing with someone that was capable enough to assassinate Cage in a rather brutal and swift manner. Do we even have any indication as to who might have been responsible for this situation? Everyone was curious as they looked towards Onoki. They assumed that he had some evidence regarding the identity of the party responsible. After all, there were few people in the world capable enough in order to pull off something like that. We don't really have any way of knowing the identity of the person spotted, but we can safely assume they are helping the Uzumaki clan with their involvement. Onoki didn't have much to give them, unfortunately. They were dealing with a careful opponent, devious, cunning. Onoki couldn't even know how the culprit was hiding among their people. He seemed to have the habit of jumping in water. That was likely how he always escaped the scene of the crime, so he could swim fast enough to keep up with their boats at the very least. I remember when the ships were getting destroyed, I remember seeing a strange silhouette in the waters. I didn't think much of it back then, but it was likely the culprit or one of the culprits. The Reikage seemed to have calmed down, now that the smaller villages were no longer as hostile to him. It's likely a group. That could explain how they were able to kill everyone on the ship of Kemurigaka. Otherwise, it would have taken someone on the level of the 5 cage to pull such a thing off silently. Yusuzo spoke out again, trying to remember the detail of that scene a bit more. The way everyone had died there was a bit too systematic. It was either the work of a good assassin squad or a figure powerful enough to not be unknown. I also agree with that, although only one person has been spotted. We can safely assume that this is the work of a group. The Reikage nodded in agreement. Onoki also nodded, but he didn't say anything yet. Silence spread out throughout the room as everyone tried to understand how the Uzumaki clan would be able of such a thing. Did the Uzumaki infiltrate us during our departure? No, our shinobi should have noticed something like that. We searched all of the boats thoroughly. There were no stowaways. It's also unlikely for there to be someone using the transformation jutsu. Again, a more experienced shinobi would have picked up on it immediately. Does that mean the culprits are just swimming alongside us? Or maybe clinging onto our ships from the outside? Even then, our senses haven't felt a thing. It's unreal. Conversations quickly broke out as the cage present all started brainstorming. They needed to find the most likely situation, the most likely culprit. They knew that they were helping the Uzumaki clan, but they didn't know if they were the Uzumaki clan. Even then, there are few groups that can match this description in the world. Yes, we already know the strength of the Uzumaki clan. Even their elite shinobi shouldn't be able to pull off such an operation. Silence spread throughout the room once more as the cage struggled to think of a possible culprit. There is one person that I've heard of capable enough to avoid all of her senses and reportedly powerful enough to pull off such assassinations. Yusuzo was the one to speak up next, immediately capturing the attention of everyone present. The Reikage also scowled a bit as an image was painted in his mind, a very familiar image. The red dot. He needs no introduction really. He is the founder and current leader of the Dark Brotherhood, a bounty hunter association situated in the Land of Iron. Yusuzo immediately brought up the one person he thought capable of such a thing, the Red Dot. Everyone knew that moniker, everyone knew of his capabilities. He was capable enough to stroll through whatever land he wanted undetected. He was strong enough to take out an entire hidden village. But did he even have the motive to help the Uzumaki clan? He had shown no indication that he was interested in them in the past. Regardless, he did become the main suspect in the minds of many. I don't think he's responsible for this incident. Surprisingly, the Reikage was the one to speak out in favor of Ken. Everyone looked at him with a bit of confusion, not quite understanding why the Reikage would bother sticking up for the infamous bounty hunter. I've worked with him in the past. He's a strange person, certainly capable enough to pull something like this off, but he is not interested in our conflicts. At least not enough to interfere. Everyone seemed surprised by the Reikage's words. It was a lesser-known fact that the two of them had worked together on a mission. No one knew the actual contents of that mission though. If even the Reikage is willing to stick up for him, then the red dot must have left quite the impression on him. The Tsuchikage narrowed his eyes as he looked at the situation with some skepticism. How can you be so sure that he wouldn't get involved? We're talking about the techniques of the Uzumaki clan here. Yasuzo was also not exactly convinced. Fuinjutsu was important to all shinobi, and anyone running an organization. He wasn't willing to just take the Reikage's word for it. The Reikage scowled a bit when seeing that not anyone was willing to believe him. Therefore, he was forced to show some of his cards, even if he's interested in Fuinjutsu. I can at least confirm that he's not here. I have some of my most capable men monitoring his actions. He's been recently spotted collecting some bounties in the Land of Iron. He had been one of the forces monitoring Ken closely, especially after their mission together. It simply wouldn't have made sense for Ken to be near the Land of Whirlpools. Not only did they have absolutely no evidence of it being him, he was also publicly spotted. How recent are we talking here? Onoki asked as he rubbed the bridge of his nose. Things were looking rather bad for them. They had absolutely no suspects if they also ruled out the red dot. The last report was yesterday before we set sail. He even appeared in public. It's not exactly unusual for him to do so either, at least in the Land of Iron, where he is reportedly in the good graces of the daemon. It could have just been a transformation, right? Onoki asked as he still hoped for them to have already found the culprit. Uncertainty was a far greater concern than blaming the wrong person to him, so he wanted to keep the blame on the red dot if possible. That would at least provide everyone with a known common enemy. But the Reikage couldn't afford the villages going after Ken and the Dark Brotherhood, especially since he still wanted to have Ken as a subordinate, or at least an ally in the future. That's why both Onoki and Yasuzo could only nod at that point, accepting the Reikage's explanation. Their lack of hard evidence somewhat stopped them from throwing any more baseless accusations, especially since the Reikage seemed adamant about protecting the red dot. Unfortunately, that also meant that they were back to square one. They had found nothing. They only knew that a person or group was sabotaging their expedition. And just as they were about to start brainstorming again, Born POV Ken, the plan had to be carried out in a hurry. I did my best to contact both the Dark Brotherhood and the Uzumaki leader for cooperation. Unfortunately, the Uzumaki clan didn't respond. Regardless, with the aid of Tosho and one of the younger recruits, we were able to create a perfect double of me. It's a good thing that so many of the children idolize me, as they all let their hair grow because of that, wanting to look more like me. And that's exactly what we needed on this occasion, a public show. It does help that I've appeared publicly plenty of times in the Land of Iron, so my presence wouldn't come into question at all. While my cover was being prepared, I had already started moving. The only real point of entry into the Land of Whirlpools is from the Land of Waves, so my destination was rather obvious. Still, just to make sure, I asked Saburo to check for rumors as to where the army of shinobi might be stationed. Funnily enough, it was exceedingly easy for him to find them, as the shinobi had been rather brazen in stealing the boats of the common folk. The underworld is ruled by various information networks, and almost all of them rely on word-of-mouth beggars, bar owners, and ramen stall owners. They all hear interesting rumors and sell them as information for Ryu. Empires are built on the back of information, and it seems that the shinobi army that's attacking the Uzumaki clan didn't make much of an effort in covering their tracks. Rather brazen. I was a tad disappointed to hear that the Reikage was also involved in this, one of the main forces participating even. I guess I shouldn't expect much more out of the leaders of the shinobi world. They don't care who they involve in their mad power struggles. Well, it's not like I cared about him all that much. He was just another useful tool, but not one vital to my plans for the future. I don't care if he dies in this war at all, especially since he's starting it. But at least the information I received gives me the certainty I needed. I didn't have a lot of time. I sealed off most of the Tenketsu in my body in order to allow an almost full transformation. My speed far exceeded that of regular shinobi, and I was able to reach the border of the Land of Whirlpools in a matter of hours, with little energy spent. From then on, I would have to swim, and swim I did. Just like before, after a few minutes of staying in the water, my body morphed to match my environment. My swimming speed became better and better as time passed, and I got used to gills and wetnet. It still almost took me an entire day to reach the shores of the Land of Waves, and by then, I could feel that the shinobi were already setting sail. They need to cross these waters to reach the land of whirlpools, and they chose this part because it's peaceful. But how about I make it not so peaceful? I started by using my claws and cutting into their ships. At first, it was small cuts trying to appear innocuous, but then I started ruining the hulls properly, which managed to sink quite a few ships. I had to stop at some point though, as I could feel the Reikage noticing me in the waters. He didn't act in any way. Thankfully, my form doesn't resemble a human all that much, so he must have assumed I'm some fish or shark. Regardless, this means I'll have to tone it down with the boat tearing, but I already did plenty of damage. A few hundred shinobi were left in rowboats, thanks to my efforts, and some even had to take turns walking on the sea. Meanwhile, the larger ships were now more packed together. I can feel the shinobi in them packed together like sardines. I waited a bit more before starting the next part of my plan, the whirlpools. It's not that hard for me to create them. I simply started using Dragon Twister underwater repeatedly. At some point, the whirlpools became self-sustaining, and I could go ahead and create more. It wasn't difficult for me, just made me dizzy at most. But I was quite satisfied when I saw hundreds get swallowed up by the currents I was creating. They did manage to undo most of them at some point, but I had already collected plenty of bodies at the bottom of the sea. Many were caught between the rocks as well, and the pressure of the ocean was keeping them down. I continued with the whirlpools for a while. Then something interesting happened. That flying midget did some kind of jutsu that completely erased my arm. It would have actually killed me if I didn't dodge it in time, so I got off easy. Regardless, I had to go to the depths and heal up. I continued with the whirlpools for a while. That stupid midget really got on my nerves. His technique is outrageously powerful. When I was hit by it, it all happened in a split second. One moment my arm was there, the next I could no longer feel it. The water was gone as well. He served as a good reminder that the strength of my scales won't be able to block every jutsu out there. I did learn to dodge his attacks by the end, but I don't even know how many limbs I've lost thanks to him at this point. Thankfully, I managed to make him kill plenty of his own as well, by keeping the current strong until the last second. That's sure to help with the morale of the Shinobi Alliance. This is as much a game of dwindling the numbers of this army, as much as it is killing their morale. Eventually, morning came, and I made sure none of these pisses ever got any sleep. I went for the weakest cage I could find first. Don't even know what village he's from, no hard feelings though. Killing his guards was relatively easy, and planting the fake evidence was just as easy. The cage himself almost put up a fight, but I blitzed him with overwhelming speed, and broke his fingers before he managed to do anything. I had to stuff his mouth with my fist before he screamed out in pain. But it wasn't that messy overall. I didn't torture him needlessly though. I killed him swiftly, then made it look like I had tortured him, before throwing him with enough precision to impale him on the mast. Blaming one of the larger hidden villages came naturally. It wasn't even that difficult to do. I didn't think it would actually stick through, but the Reikage killed the fake culprit right away, which greatly affected the morale of the Cloud village. That didn't even seem to do anything good for the Cloud. Either well, I guess it stopped the other villages from potentially attacking the Cloud, but he could have tried to prevent it in different ways. I could sense the distrust in all of the other cage present. They are certainly not going to turn their backs to the shinobi of the Cloud village anytime soon. It seems that this alliance is a lot more fragile than I had thought, so I decided to take advantage of that as well. If the smaller villages and the great ones are somewhat split, then why not blame both of the great villages? Make it look pretty and make them team up against each other. I swiftly killed off the second cage, further affecting the morale of the entire alliance, as I impaled yet another one of their leading figures on the mast of his own ship. I did it in more of a hurry though, as it was impossible to do it unnoticed at this point. There were too many people on the ship to assassinate quietly. Thankfully the cage had opened up his window to let in some air. Hope that air was worth dying for. Planting the evidence was a tad messy at this time. Couldn't really find a straggler quickly enough, so I just settled with the smallest group I could find. I assumed that, at that point, tensions were so high that it was impossible for any village to believe witness testimonies. And right I was. No one believed any of the witnesses. It's a shame that the midget managed to catch on and called that meeting. I listened to it the best I could, but I had other things to do as well, such as planting as many explosive tags on the hulls of the biggest ships, housing the most shinobi. Normally, this would be much harder, but the strongest shinobi are defending the meeting, or are stationed in the ships around it. I don't know if the cage intended their meeting to have such an effect. It might have just been the distrust that drove them to bring as many elites as possible regardless. It gave me an opportunity to really affect their numbers. It's sad that I only have so many paper bombs and explosive tags. I could have taken down their entire fleet in this manner. But oh well, time for a little explosive interruption. EOV narration. The sound of the explosion wasn't the end of it. All of the cage jumped as they felt the seas around them rattling. The shinobi that had accompanied the smaller cage all rushed outside to check the situation at the behest of their leaders. and outside was pandemonium. Fires had broken out all around them, around a dozen ships were sinking, and some had already started drowning. The screams of the less experienced shinobi rung out, further demoralizing those that were already starting up a makeshift rescue for the drowning. Water dragons rose out of the oceans to put out the fires. Shinobi also spit out water streams at the flames, in hopes of quelling them finally. Meanwhile, shinobi stepped on the uneven and wavy ocean and tried their best to pull out as many of the weaker ninjas as possible. All of the cage came out of the meeting room in that instant, and they all looked at the situation in shock. Shit. Onoki immediately took to the skies as his fears had been realized. He knew that the meeting would put all of the attention of the strongest figures in the alliance in one place. He just hoped that the villagers had been smart enough to not do exactly what they did well. Their intelligence wasn't exactly the issue. It was just that most of them didn't care much about the young shinobi they had called to the war. Most of the cage only cared about the safety of the village, and a shinobi dying in a mission was considered an honor for them to be able to die for their village. Not all of the cage were that uncaring, though the Reikage had come completely alone, as was customary for someone as strong as him. Yusuzo was also completely alone as a Jinchuriki. He was already a powerhouse. He didn't believe himself to be in need of protection of any kind. One or two of the other smaller cage also left behind enough people to protect the weaker shinobi. They were most vulnerable after all. Unfortunately, not all of the cage seemed to understand the importance of having more numbers, and they were about to take heavy losses. All of the ships that were sunk belonged to those from the smaller villages. Ken had tried to stick a few paper tags on one of the Reikage's ships, but they were swiftly noticed by the more experienced shinobi that were more alert. They still took some damage, but they were able to mitigate most of it with some clever jutsus to contain the damage of the explosions. Ken thankfully mostly prioritized destroying the ships with the most people, but with the weakest shinobi. Basically, he aimed to kill off as much cannon fodder as he could in one fell swoop. The cage also realized the intentions of their saboteur/saboteurs, and they immediately sprung into action, a bit too late for many of their shinobi, unfortunately. As soon as the explosions died down, whirlpools started appearing once more all around their fleet. But there was a stark difference. This time, they weren't appearing one by one, they were appearing multiple at the same time. The Reikage grit his teeth as he jumped up and climbed onto the mast of the ship they were on. That Tsuchikage was already floating around there, looking at the situation with rage. In the distance, the Reikage was able to see a flash of lightning dashing into the waters. Is going towards the saboteurs. I'm plunging in as well. You do your best to stop as many whirlpools as possible. The Reikage wasted no time as a lightning aura rose around him, and he dove towards the waters. I know already. Onoki flew as fast as he could to the nearest whirlpool, and brought his hands together, forming a triangle with his fingers as a white light took shape in the middle of his hand sign. The light then expanded into a pillar that shot down into the middle of the whirlpool he floated above. Onoki sweated a bit as he realized that he may have injured quite a few of their own men. The struggle continued after that. Onoki moved around from whirlpool to whirlpool, trying his best to destroy them while minimizing the damage. Meanwhile, the stronger people around them were doing their best to pull away as many people as possible to make way for Onoki's attacks. They weren't having much success. Unfortunately, not everyone was well versed in water-style jutsu, which was rather imperative. That was when Yusuzo stepped in. Flew in more like. He was covered in a thick dark yellow chakra cloak, completely covering his body in clothes. On his back were 4 large wings that beat at great speeds. Near his tailbone was one chakra tentacle that shot towards the water, and coiled around as many shinobi as possible, pulling them out of Onoki's way with ease. But only one tentacle wasn't going to be enough. He morphed his form to match his need, and his one large tentacle separated in several, all acting alongside Onoki and allowing him to disperse as many whirlpools as possible. Onoki greatly appreciated the assistance. The two of them were able to take care of things more smoothly, while the other cage had all gone to aid their own villages. Even with all of them working together, the chaos raged on for a good 10 more minutes. Before things finally calmed down, Onoki panted a bit, as he had somewhat exhausted his chakra reserves. He could still go on if needed, but he also knew that he needed to preserve his energy. So he floated down and back onto his ship, letting the others continue with the cleanup. Yusuzo was completely fine. Chakra exhaustion was not a concern for a Jinchuriki. The chakra tentacles he had grown out of his tail were still putting people on broken pieces of wood to keep them afloat. The Jinchuriki eventually turned back to normal, judging the situation to be under control. This is a fucking mess. Yusuzo scowled underneath his cage mask as he crossed his arms. Then, he noticed a bit of blood rising out of the waters nearby. After the blood came a rather burly arm, one of a darker skin tone. That was when Yusuzo remembered something rather crucial. Wait, didn't the Reikage and his son dive in after the perpetrators? POV narration. As soon as Ken made his clones and started forming as many whirlpools as possible, it descended into the waters. Unlike before, the sensors could pick up on the use of ninjutsu, and they were able to direct aid properly. The son of the Reikage didn't hesitate for one bit. He plunged into the depths as his body sparkled with lighting. He cut through the water as steam rose up from all around him. Bubbles rose to the surface as electricity spread out everywhere the cage went. He managed to keep his eyes peeled open even under the salty sea, his cloak of lightning preventing the salt from harming his eyes. And finally, he saw it. A strange humanoid-looking creature, scaly, with fish-like features, a short black hair and a grey fox ambu mask. The strange transformation immediately reminded him of Ken, but there were also plenty of differences. Ken didn't seem to have any gills or fins, nor did he seem to have a human torso while transformed. There were plenty of other differences, but A didn't have any time to consider them all as he rushed in towards the closest clone to him. He now understood how the whirlpools were happening as well. The clones of the masked assailant just seemed to be spinning with enough velocity to create an underwater current strong enough to suck everything in. It was impressive, but A didn't have the time to marvel at it either. He knew that he had to stop the whirlpools from happening. The first clone he attacked was what first made him realize that his mission wasn't going to be as easy as he had hoped it would be. As soon as he reached the depths and came closer to the middle of one of the whirlpools, he felt his body being pulled towards the middle of it. Even he found it difficult to resist the current. But that wasn't the only issue. The clone of the masked man noticed him almost immediately, and instead of facing off against him, it decided to start running away. Underwater, A's speed seemed to be no match for the man-fish hybrid. He was left in the dust as whirlpool had already become self-sustaining. Shit. At this rate, I won't be able to catch any of them. That was when his father joined him. The rakage had been trailing behind A from the moment that he had jumped into the water. With sickening precision, the rakage sliced the clone that had been fleeing from A in two. The clone exploded into a flurry of lightning, which sparked the waters around them even further, but it wasn't able to do any harm to the rakage. The father and son duo reunited wordlessly underneath the waters, and the two of them teamed up to go after the other clones. Together, they were slower than the man and his clones, but together they could work to catch them by surprise, or so they thought. When they approached the next clone, it was ready for them. Its claws were already extended. It used the momentum from the underwater tornado it had been forming to fling itself towards A, its tail spinning towards him like a cleaver, aiming to decapitate him right away. The rakage was about to interfere, not willing to just sit by and get ignored in that way. But he wasn't being ignored at all. Before he could even react, something extremely heavy crashed into him and sent him reeling, plunging further and further into the depths of the sea. The rakage was forced to exhale a bit as he was smacked into the bottom of the ocean. It was then that the rakage noticed the actual speed of their opponent. Shit. This thing is as fast in water as I am on land. We need to get out of here. The rakage now knew that he had no chance of facing the shinobi in water, so he immediately went all out. Black lightning extended from his body as all light vanished around him. He was in the abyss of the ocean, and as soon as he turned to his black lighting, all of his vision was gone. Maybe it was a foolish thing to do, as he had no way of knowing how the man he was fighting fared in the dark. But it was also the only way that the rakage saw himself matching his opponent in speed. The only problem, the rakage had been completely separated from his son. Shit. The water around him bubbled as he started swimming upwards at renewed speeds. It was then that four figures circled around him, like sharks circling around freshwater fish. One of the figures passed by the rakage, hitting him with a tail strike that caused the rakage to spin underneath the water. The rakage grabbed the man-fish hybrid by the tail, tugging him closer as he tried to escape. He didn't hesitate for a moment as he snapped the neck of the figure, only for it to explode into lightning once more. More clones seemed to gather around him though, which was proving troublesome, especially now that the rakage could hardly see them. The rakage scowled as he realized the intentions of his enemy. He's trying to slow me down. Shit. I need to get to A. And while he was struggling to fight and reach the surface, A was off trying to fight who he assumed was the original masked man. He had witnessed him making more clones after all, so it was a rather obvious conclusion. He realized that there was a speed difference, but he knew that as long as he managed to grab onto anything, he would win. The original seemed to have started forming yet another whirlpool. Most of them had already died down, as the clones were focusing on the rakage now, so A had an easy time spotting the original in the eye of that whirlpool. He dashed towards the fish-man hybrid with fury, his hand outstretched and hopping to latch onto the man's tail at the very least. The masked man seemed to notice him. He immediately turned tail and ran, but he seemed to get snagged into the current of the whirlpool for a few seconds, and A knew to take advantage of that. With a confident smile on his face, he grasped onto the tail of the original. The rakage's lighting burned bright as he prepared to pull himself towards the masked man. It was only then that he noticed it. A white light was quickly approaching him from above. Immediately recognized it as the Tsuchikage's dust release. He immediately let go of the tail and tried to move and dodge the dust release jutsu. He wasn't as fast as he would have been on land, but he could still avoid it maybe. But then the tail that he had let go of coiled around his arm, pulling him back in. A's eyes widened in fear as he only got one last look at the masked man. Curse why? He didn't even get to finish his thoughts before his entire being was erased alongside the whirlpool. that he had been struggling to escape. POV Ken, and just like that, only an outstretched hand was left of A, still clutching onto my tail. I couldn't help but let a smile reach my lips. I flung the arm back to the surface. I've no need for it, but it will serve a nice message for the Reikage and the Cloud Village. I've done enough damage for now. From here on out, I just need to lay low and observe. Now, I can finally allow myself to vanish into the depths of the sea, hiding in places that even the sun can't reach. The Reikage finally managed to deal with my clones. By the feel of it too, he seems to be on his last legs, running out of air. But I don't feel like killing him. He had proved useful in that meeting from earlier, after all. Still, so much for A. His impulsiveness is what got him in the end. I set up a rather obvious trap. He should have known that Tsuchikage was working to undo my whirlpools. He just got blinded by the prospect of catching me. Oh well, good riddance. He was always hostile to me. I wouldn't have trusted him to be as agreeable as his father. Once he took over as Reikage, it's better this way. Still, I couldn't help but sigh internally as my senses washed over the multitude of bodies that had accumulated at the bottom of the sea, all trapped there by the pressure. The bodies are so warm that nature energy still exudes from some of them. Some even still have chakra signatures, but they all are just as good as dead. So much bloodshed. All because shinobi can't even try to coexist peacefully in the end. I can only shake my head in disappointment and let the pressure of the sea massage my somewhat tired muscles. Well, at the very least, I hope that the Reikage learned a lesson from this. POV narration: the Reikage returned to the surface in a flurry. He noticed that the fight was over, so he assumed his son was already somewhere on the ships. After looking for a few minutes, he ran into the Tsuchikage, who was still resting. Old Ilnoki didn't seem to have any idea of where his son could be. He was merely catching his breath and had been doing so ever since the situation had concluded. The Reikage continued looking and eventually ran into Yusuzo as well, looking intact and clean, like he had just watched from the sidelines the entire time. But the Reikage knew better than to assume that. He knew that Jinchuriki were powerful, and very rarely were they cowards. "Oi, Jinchuriki!" the Reikage shouted. He tried to appear calm and authoritative, but panic somewhat seeped into his voice. Yusuzo didn't seem to have any reaction to meeting him. "Yes, Lord Reikage," Yusuzo answered, his voice devoid of any fear, his eyes hidden by his hat. "Have you seen my son, eh? He's basically the spitting image of me, just younger." The Reikage provided a basic description as he clenched his fists. "The last time I had seen him, he had plunged into the waters. You followed after him. Did something happen?" Yusuzo tilted his head slightly as he observed the Reikage. "Shit." The Reikage lashed out when hearing that. Not at Yusuzo, just in general. He kicked a plank and cracked the wooden pieces of wood they were floating on. "We got separated in the middle of it. Our enemy seems to be specialized in underwater fights." The Reikage was still able to compose himself and give a basic explanation as he rubbed his forehead in frustration. "I see, but I assume most of his attention was focused on you, right? I'm sure your son can handle himself. Who knows? Maybe he's giving chase and trying to catch the enemy." Yusuzo quickly attempted to calm down the Reikage to soothe his thoughts, and it seemed to work out just fine. The Reikage sighed and shook his head. "That man didn't seem able to damage me even in my regular lightning mode. It should be just fine. Thank you for the assurance. I guess we'll have to go on with the mission while waiting for him to catch up to us." The Reikage was clearly still worried, but he didn't seem to want to prioritize his worries instead of the mission. Instead, he went back to his people. They needed his guidance. Meanwhile, Yusuzo's gaze narrowed as he scowled. "It's safe to assume that A is dead." He had already studied that on. He had hidden it in a scroll before the Reikage had arrived there, so he knew who it belonged to. The cut was too clean to the point where it didn't even look like it was cut. It wasn't hard for Yusuzo to assume what could have done that. Just earlier, the Tsuchikage had been spamming a jutsu capable of causing such wounds. The arm had some marks on it, as something extremely strong had coiled around it and exerted a lot of force. It was almost as if he had been held in place. I can easily paint a picture of what happened down there is dead, and the Tsuchikage may have unintentionally killed him. Yusuzo could only clench his teeth together as he realized just how much that fact complicated the situation. This saboteur really is fucking with us, isn't he? And that's the end of this episode. The series will continue in the next part, so be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share, and comment down below. This really helps with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks for watching. We'll be seeing you in the next part. Check out these videos right here for more awesome isekai anime content.